Clara Whitcomb pressed her last silver dollar so hard into her palm that the eagle left a mark on her skin. Then she stepped between a raised whip and a screaming black stallion and said the words that made a whole town laugh. "I'll buy him." A starving widow. 1 coin. The meanest horse in the county. Before you ride with Clara into Mercy Ford, subscribe and follow her story all the way to the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach didn't stop long enough in Mercy Ford for a body to be sure it had ever stopped at all. Clara Whitcomb stepped down into the summer heat with a carpet bag in one hand and everything else she owned held tight against her chest, which was to say she was holding nothing but a memory and a single silver dollar. The dress she wore had been black once. 300 miles of sun had burned it down to the color of dead leaves, and the hem had frayed itself into something like a fringe. She had buried her husband in a dress the same shade beside a trail nobody would ever name, and she had walked away from that grave without letting herself look back, because she had learned by then that looking back was a thing a woman could not afford. "You getting off or not, ma'am?" the driver asked. He didn't wait for the answer. He had already snapped the reins, so Clara stood alone at the edge of a town that did not want her, and she counted the only thing she had left to count. $1. She had eaten last 2 days ago. She'd told herself the hunger was a small thing, and mostly she believed it because grief has a way of taking up so much room inside a person that there isn't space left for the belly to complain. But her hands shook now when she thought they'd hold still, and there was a ringing behind her eyes that came and went like a church bell heard from far off. She needed work. She needed it today. Clara had crossed half of Missouri and a good stretch of the territory on the strength of one talent, and it was not a talent that made a woman welcome. She could gentle a horse no man could touch. She'd done it since she was 9 years old, standing on the bottom rail of her daddy's fence, watching how a frightened animal breathed. Her husband Thomas used to say she could hear what a horse was thinking a full minute before the horse thought it. He'd said it like a compliment. Most men said it like an accusation. She started walking. The main street of Mercy Ford was one long argument between a dry goods store, a bank with a fresh coat of paint, a church, and 4 saloons. Folks stood in clusters under the awnings, the way folks do when there is news, and the news, whatever it was, had drawn them all toward the far end of town, where the dust rose thick and gold above a corral. A woman in a fine green dress watched Clara come, and her mouth folded up small. "You lost, dear?" the woman asked. Her voice carried the particular sweetness of a person who wants the whole street to hear her be kind so that everyone can admire it. This isn't the sort of town that has much use for drifters. "I'm not a drifter, ma'am," Clara said. "I'm looking for honest work." The woman's eyes traveled down the ruined dress and back up, taking a full inventory. "There's a boarding house can take laundry. If you've $1 for the week—" "I've $1, Clara said quietly. "That's all I've got." The woman gave a little laugh, soft as a slap. "Well, then I'd hold on to it if I were you." Clara did not stay to be measured further. She had been measured by finer women than this in finer towns, and it had taught her that some doors were closed before a body ever knocked. She walked on toward the dust and the noise, and it was only when she got close enough to hear it that she understood what the whole town had come to watch. They had come to watch something die. The corral belonged to a big spread, a ranch by the look of the branded stock in the pens behind it. Calder Creek burned into every hide. Inside the rails, 3 grown men were trying to break a horse, and the horse was not letting himself be broken. He was black. Not brown black, not the dusty, near black of a working animal, but black. The way a moonless night is black, so that even in the white summer glare, he seemed to carry his own patch of darkness with him. He was big through the chest, and long in the leg, and there was blood on his flank where a rope had burned him raw. 2 men hauled on that rope. A third circled with a whip. The stallion screamed. It was not a sound Clara had heard many horses make. It was the sound of an animal that has decided it would rather be killed than be owned, and she knew that sound because there had been a season of her own life where she'd made the same decision in her heart, if not out loud. "Get his head down," the man with the whip bellowed. He was a big fellow, broad as a barn door with a red face and a jaw like the corner of a house. When he brought the whip down, the crack of it made the whole crowd flinch, and the horse reared straight up and pawed the air, and the two men on the rope were dragged forward through the dirt on their heels. "Hold him, damn you! He won't hold Rufus. He'll hold, or I'll put a bullet in him, and we'll skin him for the tannery." The name went around the crowd in a satisfied murmur. Rufus. Rufus Pike. Clara gathered from the way folks said it that Rufus Pike was a man of some standing here, the sort of standing that comes from being feared rather than loved, and that the town rather enjoyed watching him do a cruel thing because it meant the cruelty wasn't being aimed at them. "Bet you $1 he don't break him," a man near Clara said. "Bet you $1 he shoots him by supper," said another, and they both laughed. Clara stood at the rail and watched midnight fight, and something inside her that had been asleep for 300 miles came awake. She could see it, plain as scripture. Every man in that corral was making the same mistake, and it was the mistake of a frightened man, which is to answer fear with more fear, until the whole world is nothing but fear, feeding on itself. The horse wasn't wild. Wild, she could have understood. The horse was terrified, and worse than terrified, the horse had been hurt so many times by so many hands that he had stopped believing a hand could be anything but a thing that hurt him. She could see it in the whites of his eyes, in the way he flinched from the left, where somebody sometime had done him a lasting harm. He wasn't a devil. He was a widow, same as her. All he had left was the refusing. "You'll kill him," Clara said. She hadn't meant to say it loud, but the crowd had gone quiet at just that moment the way crowds do, and her voice fell into the silence clear as a dropped plate. Rufus Pike turned around. He looked at her the way the woman in the green dress had looked at her, only worse, because a man like Rufus did not bother to hide his contempt behind sweetness. He looked at the ruined dress. He looked at the dust on her face and the carpet bag at her feet, and he decided in about 1 second exactly what she was worth, which was nothing. "You say something, missus." "I said you'll kill him," Clara said. "You keep on the way you're going, and inside an hour you'll have a dead horse and a story about how he was too mean to live, and you'll believe it too, 'cause it's easier than believing you're the one that made him that way." The crowd made a sound, a low, delighted, dangerous sound, the sound of people who have just realized the entertainment has gotten better than they hoped. Rufus Pike walked to the rail. He was even bigger up close, and he coiled the whip in his hand, slow, letting her look at it. "And what would a scarecrow like you know about horses?" "Enough to know a broke man when I see one holding a whip," Clara said. It went dead quiet. Somewhere a dog barked. A man behind her whispered, "Lord have mercy," under his breath, and it was not clear whether he meant it as a prayer or a review. Rufus Pike's red face went a deeper red. For one moment Clara thought he might come over the rail at her, and she stood her ground the way she had learned to stand it, because she had discovered on the trail that running only teaches the world you can be chased. "Rufus." The voice came from the far side of the corral, and it was not loud, but every head turned to it. A man had been sitting a big claybank horse in the shade so still that Clara had taken him for part of the fence. He was tall in the saddle, older than her by some years, dressed plain, but dressed well with the kind of stillness about him that a body only earns by carrying something heavy for a long time. He didn't look angry. He didn't look much of anything. His face had the closed, shuttered look of a house whose people have all moved away, and Clara knew that look too, because she had washed it off her own face in creek water more mornings than she could count. "Mr. Calder," Rufus said, and there was a change in him. Not respect exactly. The careful voice a man uses on the one person who can take his living away. "I got it in hand. You've had it in hand 2 hours." Wyatt Calder walked his horse forward at a slow amble until he was inside the rail and looking down at the black stallion, and then at Clara, and there was no particular kindness in the look. Only a cold, tired curiosity, like a man who has stopped expecting the world to show him anything he hasn't already seen. "That horse cost me $200 in Kansas City. He's crippled 3 good hands, and he ain't been ridden a single step. I ought to have shot him a month ago." "Then why haven't you?" Clara asked. Wyatt Calder looked at her a long moment. "Ma'am, I don't believe that's your concern." "You haven't shot him," Clara said, "because some part of you can't stand to. Same part that keeps you sitting out here in the shade watching instead of riding off to your dinner. You keep hoping somebody'll figure him out, so you don't have to be the man who killed him." Now Clara did not know why she said it. It was not a thing a hungry woman with $1 ought to say to a rich man in front of his whole town. But she had buried the only person on earth who'd ever thought her worth listening to. And there is a recklessness that comes over a person who has already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing. She had nothing left to protect. It made her honest in a way that frightened even her. For just an instant, so quick that afterward, she'd wonder if she imagined it something moved behind Wyatt Calder's closed face. A crack in the shutter. There and gone. "I'll buy him," Clara said. The laughter started slow and built like weather. It rolled up from the men at the rail and swept back through the crowd until it seemed the whole of Mercy Ford was laughing. The woman in the green dress laughing behind her glove. The man who'd bet $1 laughing so hard he had to hold his hat. Clara stood in the middle of it and did not laugh and did not look away and did not let her chin drop even the width of a hair. "You'll buy him," Rufus said, wiping his eye. "With what, sweetheart? You'll trade him that dress, he'd eat it and still throw you." "How much?" Clara said to Wyatt. "It ain't about how much," Rufus said. "Look at her, Mr. Calder. She ain't got 2 coins to knock together." "How much?" Clara said again, and this time she said it only to Wyatt Calder, as if Rufus Pike were a fly she could not be troubled to swat. Wyatt studied her, and whatever he saw made him do a strange thing. He did not laugh. "You're serious," he said. "I have never in my life been more serious about anything, Mr. Calder." "That horse'll kill you?" "He might," Clara agreed. "But you'll pardon me for saying it, that's your worry gone, not mine. You want shed of a horse you can't bear to kill and can't afford to keep. I'll take him off your hands and off your conscience both. Name your price." The crowd had stopped laughing. They had smelled something the way a crowd does some turn in the wind, and they leaned in. Wyatt Calder looked down at her from the height of his horse, and Clara looked up at him, and for a moment the whole town might as well have vanished because the argument was only between the two of them now. "What's your name?" he said. "Clara Whitcomb." "You got a husband, Mrs. Whitcomb, come to sign for this foolishness?" "I buried him in April," Clara said, and she said it plain without a wobble, because she had promised herself she would never again say those words in a way that let a stranger see the hole they came out of. "So there's nobody to sign for me, and nobody to talk me out of it. What'll he cost me?" Something passed over Wyatt's face at the word buried. Just a flicker. The shutter again. "You've got money then, to have come all this way." Clara opened her hand. She held it up so he could see, so the whole leaning, breathless crowd could see the single silver dollar sitting in her dirty palm with the eagle's mark still pressed into her skin beside it. It caught the sun. It was the smallest amount of money a person could have and still be said to have money at all, and she held it up like it was the crown jewels of England, because to her, in that moment, it was. $1, she said. "I'll give you $1 for him." The silence that followed was worse than the laughter had been. Rufus Pike broke it. "That's Mr. Calder, that's an insult, is what that is. She's making fools of the whole $1. "It's every cent I have in the world," Clara said, still holding it up, still looking only at Wyatt. "I know what it looks like. I know what you all think of me. But I'm not making a fool of anybody, Mr. Calder. I'm offering you a true and honest trade. You give me a horse you can't use and can't kill. I give you every dollar to my name. That's not a joke. That's 2 people both out of choices making the only deal that's left to 'em." For a long moment, nobody moved. Wyatt Calder looked at the silver dollar in her hand. Then he looked at midnight, at the blood on the black flank, at the white-rimmed eye, at the trembling that ran through the animal even now standing still. A trembling Clara understood was not rage, but something much closer to heartbreak. And then Wyatt Calder looked back at Clara, and for the first time since he'd walked his horse into that ring, he wasn't looking at her like a scarecrow, or a drifter, or a foolish woman. He was looking at her, the way one survivor looks at another, across the wreck of a thing they both got out of alive. "Rufus," he said. "Give her the horse." The crowd erupted. "Mr. Calder." "You heard me." Wyatt's voice didn't rise, but it cut through everything, and Rufus Pike shut his mouth like a trap. "Take her dollar. It's a legal sale. Somebody witness it." "I'll witness it." The man who stepped up was thin and gray, and wore a tin star gone dull with age. He had the tired, cautious look of a lawman who has learned that the smartest thing to do in most quarrels is nothing at all. "Amos Bell, Sheriff. You sure about this Mr. Calder woman gets herself killed on your ground folks'll talk?" "Folks always talk, Amos," Wyatt said. He swung down off his claybank at last, and up close on the ground. He was taller than Clara had reckoned, and more tired-looking. A big man wearing his grief like a coat he'd forgotten he had on. He crossed to the rail and held out his hand. Clara put the silver dollar in it. His fingers closed over the coin, and for just a breath his hand and hers were both touching the last money she had in the world, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. And neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that this was madness, and that they were both going to do it anyway. "He's yours," Wyatt Calder said. "God help you." "I don't reckon I'll need God," Clara said. "I'll need everybody to be quiet." She bent and set her carpetbag down against the rail. Careful, the way a body sets down a thing that is all they own. She straightened. She looked at the crowd, at the woman in green, at the betting men, at Rufus Pike, coiling and uncoiling his whip with his big red hands, and then she did the thing that made them start to whisper which before the afternoon was even over. She climbed the rail and dropped down inside the corral with the horse that had crippled 3 men. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the sheriff started. "Quiet now," she said, not sharp, almost gentle. She said it the way you'd hush a room where somebody was sleeping. "All of you, just for a little while, give us the quiet." And then she did not do a single one of the things they expected. She didn't reach for the trailing rope. She didn't pick up the whip Rufus had dropped in the dust. She didn't advance on the horse at all. She walked to the center of the corral, well away from him, and she stopped, and she turned herself a little to the side, so she wasn't square on, and she looked down at the ground, and not at his eyes, and she let her shoulders come down soft, and she began in a low, unbroken murmur that the front row could just barely hear to talk to him. Nobody ever afterward agreed on what she said. Some said it was scripture. Some said it was a lullaby. The truth, though, Clara never told a soul, was that she was talking to Thomas. She was telling her dead husband about the road and the grave beside the trail, and the 300 miles, and the way the hunger had stopped feeling like hunger somewhere in Kansas and started feeling like a kind of quiet. She talked to the horse the way she'd have talked to Thomas if the fever had left him one more night, and every word of it was true, and a horse cannot understand English, but a horse can understand truth, because a horse spends his whole life reading the thing underneath the words. Midnight pinned his ears. He stamped. He swung his hindquarters toward her, the beginning of a kick, and the crowd sucked in its breath as one and Rufus Pike said low and hopeful, "Here it comes." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't stop talking. She didn't even look up. The kick never came. The black horse stood there with his muscles bunched and his heart going like a drum. You could see beating in his throat, and he waited for the whip, and the whip didn't come. And he waited for the rope to haul his head down, and the rope didn't come. And he waited for the shouting, and the fear, and the pain that had followed every human hand he'd ever known, and none of it came. There was only this small, ruined woman in the middle of the ring, not looking at him, not coming at him, standing soft and talking low, taking up no more room in the world than she had to. He didn't understand it. You could see him not understanding it. And a horse that doesn't understand a thing will do one of 2 things. He'll run from it, or he'll get curious about it. And there is only about a hair's width between those 2, and everything in Clara Whitcomb's life had come down to living in that hair's width. His ears came forward. One of them. Just one. "Look!" A woman in the crowd breathed. Clara turned slow, as the hour hand of a clock, until she faced a little more toward him, and she lifted one hand not toward him, just up, palm open, low by her hip, The way you'd hold your hand if you wanted a body to see you weren't carrying anything. And she waited. She let him make it his idea. That was the whole secret, the one thing not one of those grown men had understood in 2 hours of ropes and whips. You cannot take a broken thing. You can only make yourself into a place safe enough that it decides on its own to come. Midnight took one step toward her. The crowd did not laugh now. Nobody bet $1 now. 200 people stood at the rails of that corral in the dead heat of a Mercy Ford summer and held their breath while a starving widow and a killer horse closed the last 20 feet between them, one slow step at a time, and the only sound in all the world was Clara's low, unbroken voice telling a dead man about the road. He stopped an arm's length from her, close enough to kill her in half a second. His nostrils worked, drinking her in the sweat, and the road, and the grief, and the fearlessness of her and Clara stood with her open hand low at her hip, and did not close the distance, because it was still his to close. And he closed it. The great black head came down and forward until his nose touched her open palm, soft as a question, and Clara Whitcomb, who had not wept at the grave, who had not wept in 300 miles, who had promised herself she was done, weeping, felt her eyes fill, and let one single tear cut a clean line down through the dust on her face, and did not make a sound. "I know," she whispered to the horse. "I know. Me too." She raised her other hand slow and laid it flat along his neck over the place where the rope had burned him raw, and he flinched, but he didn't pull away. He let her. He stood there and let a human hand rest on his hurt, maybe the first hand in his whole hard life that had touched him without meaning to take something, and a long shudder went down the length of him like a man setting down a weight. He's carried so long he forgot it wasn't part of his own body. Rufus Pike said, "It's a trick. She drugged him, or—" "Shut up, Rufus," said Wyatt Calder very quietly, and he did not take his eyes off Clara. She stood with the horse for a while. Long enough that a couple of folks at the back, disappointed there'd be no blood, drifted off toward the saloons. She wasn't performing. She had in truth near forgotten the crowd was there. She ran her hand along his neck and down his shoulder, learning him, and he learned her back, lipping at her sleeve, blowing warm breath against her collarbone, and by degrees the trembling went out of him, and something in the ruined woman eased too, so that a body watching close might have said it was hard to tell by the end which of the two was gentling which. Then Clara Whitcomb did the thing that Mercy Ford would still be arguing about at Christmas. She gathered a handful of the black mane, spoke 3 words nobody heard, and swung herself up onto the bare back of the horse that had never been ridden. The whole crowd came up off the rails. Midnight's head flew up. His whole body gathered, coiled, every ounce of him, wanting to explode, and for one terrible held breath, the afternoon hung on a knife's edge, and Rufus Pike's hand dropped toward the gun on his hip, almost hopeful, and Clara leaned down low over the black neck and put her mouth beside the flicking ear and said so soft, "Easy, easy now, darlin'. We already been through the worst of it, you and me. Ain't nothing left out here can hurt us." And the horse did not buck. He stood quivering, taking her weight, the first weight he had ever agreed to carry, and then he took one step and another, and Clara touched him with nothing but the shift of her own body, no rein, no bit, no spur, and the black stallion walked. He walked in a slow circle around the ring ears, swiveling nostrils wide, and Clara sat him easy as a woman sits a rocking chair, one hand light on his neck, tears drying in the dust on her face, and something on her mouth that was not quite a smile, because it was too big and too broken to be only that. Then she turned him toward the gate. "Sheriff," she said, "would you get that for me?" Amos Bell looked at Wyatt Calder. Wyatt Calder looked at the widow on the devil horse, and whatever was behind his shuttered face had come all the way to the surface now, and it looked of all the things in the world like a man who has just remembered something he thought he'd lost forever. He nodded once. The sheriff swung the gate wide, and Clara Whitcomb rode the worst stallion in the county out of the corral and down the middle of the main street of Mercy Ford, past the bank and the church and the 4 saloons, past the men who'd bet $1 she'd be dead by supper, past the woman in the green dress whose glove had come away from her open mouth, past Rufus Pike standing in the dust with his whip hanging useless from his fist, and a look on his red face that was not shame. Shame would pass, but the beginning of a hate that would not. She rode him out easy $1 poorer, and a whole life richer, sitting straight-backed in her ruined black dress on a horse the whole world had wanted dead, and she did not look back, because she had learned by then that looking back was a thing a woman could not afford. But this one time, she thought that if she had looked back, she might have finally seen something worth turning around for. Behind her alone and the rail, Wyatt Calder stood with a silver dollar closed in his fist, so tight, the eagle left a mark in his palm too, and for the first time in 3 long years, the shuttered house of his face let in a little light. She kept the horse at a walk all the way down to the far end of the street, and when she reached the water trough outside the livery, she stopped him there and let him drink. And only then did she realize her hands were shaking so hard she could barely keep them on his neck. "You did that," she whispered to Midnight. "You, not me. Don't let him ever tell you different." She'd meant to ride him straight out of Mercy Ford and never come back. That had been the whole plan, such as it was, in the 2 seconds she'd had to make one. Ride him out, get clear of the crowd, and then nothing. She had no money. She had no destination. She had a horse she couldn't feed, and a carpet bag she'd left leaning against the corral rail of the man who'd just sold her the animal for every cent she owned. Behind her boots came down the middle of the street. Unhurried. She knew whose they were before she turned. "Mrs. Whitcomb?" Wyatt Calder had her carpet bag in his hand. He held it out to her, and she took it, and neither of them said anything for a moment about the fact that a rich man had walked the length of his own town, carrying a poor woman's bag. "You forgot this," he said. "I didn't forget it," Clara said. "I set it down so I wouldn't drop it when he threw me. Figured if I was going to die, I'd rather not have my whole life scattered in the dirt for folks to pick through." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. "He didn't throw you." "No," she said. "He didn't. I've seen a lot of horsemen, ma'am. Paid good money for some of the best. I never once saw a thing like what I saw in that ring today." He looked at the black stallion drinking at the raw place on his flank where the rope had burned him, and his jaw worked. "What are you fixing to do with him?" And there it was. The question she had no answer for. Clara looked down at the dust on her boots, and pride fought hunger inside her, the way it had been fighting for a week, and hunger, as it always did, in the end, won. "I don't rightly know Mr. Calder," she said, and it cost her to say it. "I got a horse and $1's worth of nothing, and no place to put either one. I expect you think I'm a fool. I think," Wyatt said slowly, "that I've got 40 head of green horses eating their heads off in my pastures that 3 grown men can't do a thing with. And I think I just watched a woman ride the worst of the lot bareback down my main street." He paused. "I've got work, Mrs. Whitcomb, if you want it. Room and board, and a fair wage. You gentle my stock, and I'll not ask you a single question about where you came from or why." Clara looked up at him. She had learned on this trail to be suspicious of kindness, because kindness offered to a woman alone came most often with a price stitched into the lining. She searched his face for it. She was good at reading faces the way she was good at reading horses, and she found in his no leer, no calculation, nothing but a tiredness so deep it had worn a groove, and underneath the tiredness, something she couldn't name yet, but recognized all the same because she carried it herself. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why would you do that? You don't know me. An hour ago I insulted you in front of your whole town." "You didn't insult me," Wyatt said. "You told me the truth. There's a difference, though. I'll grant you most folks around here can't tell it." He shifted the weight on his feet. "You said I couldn't stand to kill that horse. You were right. I've been paying 3 men to fail at breaking him for a month, rather than do the one sensible thing, which is put a bullet in him. I didn't know why until you said it out loud." He looked at her steady. "A man doesn't hear the truth about himself very often, Mrs. Whitcomb. When he does, he ought to at least offer the person who told it to him a job." Clara held his gaze a long moment. Then she nodded once. "I'll want a stall for him," she said. "A good one, away from the others where he can settle. And I'll not have that man Rufus Pike within 100 feet of him." "Rufus is my foreman." "Then he can foreman the other end of the ranch," Clara said. "I mean it, Mr. Calder. That horse'll never trust a soul as long as he can smell the man who burned him. I'll do your work, and I'll do it well, but I'll do it my way, or I'll take my dollar's worth of trouble and walk on." Wyatt Calder looked at her, this ruined woman in her sunburnt mourning dress, laying down conditions to the richest man in the county, like she held all the cards instead of none of them. And the almost smile came back and stayed a little longer this time. "Fair enough," he said. "You'll want to know it's a hard bargain you're driving, though. Rufus won't take kindly to being told a widow's steering him around his own ranch." "That's his trouble," Clara said. "Not mine, but it was hers." She knew it even as she said it. She had made an enemy today in front of the whole town, and she'd made him the kind of enemy that a proud, cruel man becomes when a woman shames him where his neighbors can watch. She'd seen the look on Rufus Pike's face when she rode past him. It was the look of a man tallying a debt, and men like that always came to collect. She led Midnight the 4 miles out to Calder Creek herself, on foot, walking at his shoulder rather than riding, because she wanted the horse to learn her feet as well as her seat, and because she needed the walk to steady her own nerves before she had to face a bunkhouse full of strangers who'd all heard by now what she'd done. The ranch when they came over the last rise was bigger than she'd let herself imagine. And that first evening at Calder Creek taught Clara Whitcomb something she would not forget, that a woman can ride a devil horse down a public street and still not be half so brave as she needs to be to walk into a room full of men who've already decided what she is. They were at supper when she came in. A dozen hands crowded around a long table, and the talk died the moment she stepped through the door with her carpet bag, and every fork stopped halfway to every mouth. "Well," said a voice from the head of the table. Rufus Pike. He'd gotten there ahead of her. He leaned back in his chair and let the silence stretch until it hurt. "If it ain't the horse witch herself, come to enchant our biscuits, missus." A couple of the younger hands laughed. Most didn't. Most just watched to see which way the wind would blow. Clara did not answer him. She set her bag down by the wall, and she found the empty place at the far end of the table, and she sat, and she reached for the bread, and she ate. She ate slow and steady, though her body wanted to fall on the food like an animal, because she would not give Rufus Pike the satisfaction of seeing how hungry she was. "I'm talking to you, missus." "I heard you," Clara said around a mouthful. "I just didn't reckon you'd said anything worth answering." The young hand across from her choked on his coffee. Rufus Pike's face went red in the lamplight. He put both hands flat on the table and started to rise, and it might have gone badly right there that first night, except that the door opened again, and Wyatt Calder came in, and Rufus sat back down slow like a dog that's heard its master's step. "Rufus," Wyatt said, mild as milk, "Mrs. Whitcomb will be working the green stock. She's got full run of the far corral and the end barn. You and the boys give her whatever she asks for." He let that settle. "That's not a request." "Yes, sir," Rufus said. But his eyes, when they came back to Clara, promised her that this was not finished. It was a long way from finished. She did not sleep well that first night in the line cabin they'd given her, a little one-room shack a quarter mile from the main house that had been standing empty long enough to fill up with dust and spiders. But she cleaned it, and she made a bed of it, and in the morning, before the sun was properly up, she was already out at the far corral with Midnight, because the horses did not care what the men thought of her, and the horses were the only company she wanted. It was the horses that saved her those first weeks, not the people. The people watched and whispered and waited for her to fail. But the horses came to her. Word of it spread through the ranch faster than she'd have believed. A little sorrel filly that had been so frightened of men she'd starve rather than let one near her feed Clara had her eating from the hand in 4 days. A big gray gelding that reared and struck at anyone who tried to bridle him. Clara never fought him at all, just stood in his stall each morning doing nothing, letting him get so bored with her being harmless that he forgot to be afraid, and inside a week, he'd dropped his head into the bridle himself. A pair of half-broke colts nobody could catch in the pasture came trotting up to her the third morning like she was their own mother. The young hands started finding excuses to be near the far corral. They'd hang on the rails and watch her work, and at first they watched the way you watch a hanging, hoping for a thrill. But by the second week, they were watching the way boys watch a thing they can't do and can't stop wanting to learn. "How'd you do that?" one of them finally asked her. A skinny kid named Toby, maybe 17, with a cowlick that wouldn't lie down and a way of blushing every time she looked at him direct. "That grade have killed me. He liked to broke Pete's arm. And you just stand there." "That's the whole of it," Clara said. She didn't stop working while she talked. She was picking a burr out of a young mare's tail, slow and easy. "You just stand there. Most folks, when a horse is scared, they figure the thing to do is show him there's nothing to be scared of by grabbing hold of him. But a scared thing that gets grabbed only learns it was right to be scared. You want a frightened creature to trust you, you got to give it the one thing nobody ever gave it before." "What's that?" "Time," Clara said. "Time and the freedom to say no. A horse that's allowed to walk away from you is a horse that'll choose to come to you. It's the only thing that works, Toby. It's the only thing that ever worked on anybody, horse or man." Toby chewed on that. "Rufus says you drugged Midnight. Says that's how you rode him." Clara's hands went still on the mare's tail. "Does he?" "Says you must have. Says no horse comes around that fast without something in his feed." Toby scuffed the dirt. "I don't believe him. I seen you out here every morning. Ain't nobody drugging nothing." "You watch close then," Clara said quietly, "and you make up your own mind. Don't take mine and don't take his. A man who has to lie about how a thing was done is a man that couldn't do it himself and can't stand that somebody else could." She went back to the burr. "You remember that, and you'll go further than most." She did not know Rufus Pike was standing just around the corner of the barn. She did not know he'd heard every word. But Wyatt Calder saw more than anyone gave him credit for. He was not a man who talked. He'd talked himself out years before on a night Clara knew nothing about yet, and since then he'd learned to say what he needed with things instead of words. So Clara didn't understand at first what was happening. She only noticed that things kept appearing. The first was firewood. She came back to the line cabin one cold morning. The summer nights ran cold out on the high ground to find a cord of split wood stacked neat against the wall that had not been there when she left. She asked the hands. Nobody would own to it. She figured somebody'd made a mistake and stacked it at the wrong cabin, and she used it because she wasn't fool enough to freeze on account of pride. Then it was a milk cow. A gentle old thing tied to her fence rail one morning with a note that said, "Only she's yours, keep her." No name on it. Clara stood there holding the note a long time. Then it was the roof. She'd said nothing to anyone about the roof leaking, because complaining was a habit she'd broken long ago, but there'd come a hard rain one night, and she'd lain awake moving her bed around the drips, and 3 days later, she came home to find the roof mended tight and sound and a stack of good wool blankets folded on her bed that were finer than anything she'd owned in her married life. She was not a fool. She knew there was only one man on that ranch with the means to do such things, and the standing to do them without answering to anybody. But she couldn't understand why. A rich man who wanted something from a poor woman didn't mend her roof in secret and leave without so much as knocking. He came knocking plenty, and he made sure she knew the price. This was something else. This was a man doing kindnesses and taking pains that no one ever find out he'd done them. And Clara Whitcomb had been on the earth long enough to know that the kindnesses a person hides are the truest ones there are, because they buy nothing, and they're meant to buy nothing. They're just the overflow of something a person can't hold in anymore. She caught him at it finally on the 4th week. She'd woken before dawn to a sound at her woodpile, and she'd come to the door in her shawl expecting a raccoon. And instead there was Wyatt Calder in the gray half-light quiet as a thief stacking a fresh armload of split pine against her wall. He froze when the door opened. For a moment, the pair of them just stood there. The richest man in the county, caught red-handed doing a kindness like it was a crime. "Mr. Calder," Clara said. "Mrs. Whitcomb." He straightened and cleared his throat and looked for all the world like a boy caught in the pantry. "I was just the boys they don't always keep the outlying cabins stocked proper. I was seeing to it. At 4 in the morning. I'm an early riser." "The milk cow," Clara said. "The roof, the blankets. That was you." He didn't answer. He looked down at the wood in his arms. "Why?" Clara said. It was the same question she'd asked him in the street the first day, and it came out just as bare. "And don't tell me it's on account of the horses, Mr. Calder, because a man doesn't sneak out before sunup to mend a roof over a hired hand's head on account of horses." Wyatt Calder set the wood down. He stood in the cold gray light and looked at her, and Clara watched a struggle go across his face, the struggle of a man deciding whether to open a door he'd nailed shut a long time ago. "My wife used to say a house that leaks over a person's head is a house that says you don't matter here," he said finally. His voice had gone rough. "She was a great one for what a house said. She'd have—" He stopped, started again. "There was a time I had a wife who'd have taken one look at you and had you in the main house by nightfall and fed and warm, and I'd have grumbled about it and done every bit of what she asked. I got out of the habit of it, of noticing when a person's cold. I reckon I'm trying to get back into it." He picked his hat up off the woodpile and turned it in his hands. "That's all. It's not I want you to know, it's not what a woman alone might think it is. I'm not that kind of man, Mrs. Whitcomb. You've my word." "I know you're not," Clara said softly. "I knew that the first day. A woman alone learns to tell." She wrapped the shawl tighter. "What happened to her? Your wife?" She saw the shutter start to come down over his face. She'd seen it in the corral that first day, the crack in the shutter, and then the closing, and she braced for him to turn cold and walk off. But he didn't. He stood there in the gray dawn and let the shutter stay open. Maybe because it was early and the world was quiet. Maybe because a person who mends your roof in secret is halfway to telling you the truth already. "Not this morning," he said. "I'll tell you, but not this morning." He set his hat on his head. "You'll be at the far corral today." "Every day," Clara said. "I'll come by," he said. "I'd like to watch you work, if it's no bother." "It's no bother," Clara said, and she meant it, and the meaning of it surprised her because she had not wanted a single soul's company in a long time, and here she was wanting his. He came by that day and the next, and it became a thing between them. He'd ride out to the far corral in the long light of the evening after the day's work was done, and he'd sit his claybank at the rail and watch her gentle the green stock, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't. Clara found she could work easy with him there, in a way she couldn't, with the hands hanging on the rails hoping for a show. Wyatt didn't hope for anything. He just watched quiet, and after a while, she understood that he wasn't watching the horses at all. "You talk to 'em," he said one evening. "The horses. I can't hear the words, but your mouth's always moving." "I do." "What do you say?" Clara ran her hand down the neck of the young mare she was working. "Depends on the horse," she said. "Mostly I just tell 'em the truth. Where I've been, what I lost. They can't understand the words, but they understand the feeling underneath them, and there's no feeling underneath the truth that'll frighten a horse. It's the lies that frighten them. A person walking up all false and cheerful with fear underneath, that's a thing a horse can smell a mile off, and it scares the daylights out of him because he can tell you're hiding something, and he doesn't know what." She looked over at Wyatt. "You can't fool a horse, Mr. Calder, or a child. They read what's underneath. It's only grown folks that can be fooled because grown folks want to be." Wyatt was quiet a while. "You lost a husband," he said. "You told me, in April." "I did." "How?" Clara kept her hands moving on the mare. It was easier to say hard things with her hands busy. She'd learned that. "Fever," she said. "We were coming west. There'd been trouble back home. His people never took to me, said I married beneath them, which was a laugh, considering anyway. We lit out to start fresh. Got as far as the middle of nowhere, and he took a fever, and there wasn't a doctor inside 100 miles, and I sat with him 4 days and 4 nights, and I did every single thing I knew, and none of it was enough." Her voice didn't break. She'd made sure it wouldn't telling it. "I buried him myself, dug the grave myself, wasn't anybody else to do it. And then I got back up on the wagon seat, and about 10 miles on the oxen took sick too, and died, and I sold the wagon to a passing family for near nothing, and I walked. And I kept walking till I walked into Mercy Ford with $1 in my hand." She finally looked up at him. "So there it is. That's the whole sad story. Now you know why I offered $1 for a horse everybody wanted dead, because I know what it is to be a thing the world's decided isn't worth saving, and I couldn't watch them do it to him and call it sense. The light was going gold and long across the corral. Wyatt Calder sat his horse and looked at her, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. "My wife's name was Ruth," he said. Clara went still. "We'd been married 6 years. Couldn't have children, not for the longest time. Then finally, when we'd about given up hoping he stopped. His hands had gone tight on the reins. It was a hard birth. 2 days. The doctor came out from town, but the roads were bad, and he came too late, and by the time..." He drew a breath. "I lost 'em both. Ruth and the boy the same night, inside an hour of each other. He never even drew a breath, the doctor said. And I sat in that house with the two of them, and He couldn't finish it." Clara saw the muscles work in his throat. "3 years ago," he said instead. "It'll be 3 years this fall. And I'll tell you the truth, Mrs. Whitcomb, since you told me yours. I've spent every one of those 3 years making sure I never had to feel that again. You put up enough fence, you get cold enough, you keep folks far enough off. You can build yourself a life where there's nobody left close enough to lose. I built that life. I was proud of it. And then a starving woman rode a killer horse down my street and looked at me like she could see straight through every fence I'd built and told me I couldn't stand to kill a horse because I was too busy trying not to be the kind of man who kills things." He laughed low and without much humor. "You've no idea what you walked into, ma'am, or what you knocked loose when you did." Clara stood there with her hand on the mare's neck and her heart going strange in her chest, and she understood all at once the firewood and the milk cow and the roof and the blankets, understood them the way she understood a frightened horse taking one step forward across a corral. He was a man who'd nailed every door in himself shut, and he'd found one small window he could pass a kindness through without having to open a door, and he'd been passing kindnesses through it for 4 weeks, because it was the only way he had left to say the thing he couldn't let himself say out loud. "Mr. Calder," she said gently. "Ruth's still steering you, you know. That house that says you don't matter here, you learned that from her, and you kept mending my roof to honor it. She's not gone the way you think. A person we love that much, they don't leave us. They just move into the way we do things." Something happened in Wyatt Calder's face that she would remember a long time. The shutter didn't come down. It came the rest of the way up. And a big, grieving man on a claybank horse turned his face away from a woman so she wouldn't see his eyes, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done, because it told her he trusted her enough to need to hide. "I'd best get back," he said thickly. "All right," Clara said. "I'll come by tomorrow." "I know you will." He rode off into the gold light, and Clara watched him go, and she was so caught up in the watching that she did not see the figure standing back in the shadow of the end barn, the figure that had been there the whole while, close enough to hear every word about Ruth and the boy and the fences. Rufus Pike had heard all of it, and Rufus Pike, who'd spent 3 years making himself the one man Wyatt Calder leaned on, the one man who knew the boss's grief and used the knowing of it to make himself indispensable. Rufus Pike understood standing in that shadow that a widow with $1 was about to cost him a thing worth a great deal more than $1. He found her the next morning at the far corral before Wyatt came, when it was just the two of them and the horses in the gray light. "Cozy little talks you've been having with the boss," he said. Clara didn't turn around. "Morning, Mr. Pike. Don't you morning me?" He came up to the rail and hooked his elbows over it, and there was something in his voice worse than the loud contempt he'd shown that first day. This was quiet. This was a man who'd stopped playing. "I know your kind missus. Come limping into a town with nothing, find yourself a lonesome rich man, work on him slow. Firewood 1 week, sad stories the next. I've been watching you do it. It's a real pretty piece of work." Clara turned and looked at him. "You think that's what this is?" "I know what it is. I've watched Wyatt Calder pour his heart into that dirt for 3 years, and I've kept him standing me when there wasn't a soul else could stand to be near him for the grief coming off him. And now here you come." Rufus's jaw tightened. "You'll get in that house. I can see it plain as day. You'll get in, and you'll get a ring, and you'll get half of everything the man's got, everything I built with these hands, every fence I mended, and every steer I drove, and you'll get it in a year of sad talks that I bled 20 years to earn." And there it was. Clara heard it clear, the true shape of the thing under his words, the way she heard the truth under a frightened horse. It wasn't the horses. It had never really been the horses. Rufus Pike was afraid, the way a man is afraid when he's spent his whole life making himself necessary to someone and watches that someone start to heal. "You love him," Clara said quietly. "Not the way you'd say, but you do. He's the nearest thing to family you've got, and you've kept yourself close by being the one who understood his sorrow. And now you're scared that if he stops sorrowing, he won't need you anymore." She had not meant it cruel. She'd meant it the way she said true things to horses, but she'd made the same mistake with Rufus Pike that she'd made in the corral that first day, which was to say the truth out loud to a proud man in a way that let him see she'd seen him, and where Wyatt Calder had heard the truth and offered her a job. Rufus Pike heard it and went white to the lips. "You watch yourself, missus," he said very soft. "You watch yourself real careful. Because I have got the ear of every man on this ranch, and half the town besides, and a woman alone in this world is just exactly as safe as folks decide she is." He straightened up off the rail. "You rode that devil horse into town like some kind of miracle. But there's another word for a woman does things no natural woman can do. There's an old word for it. And it's a word this county still remembers how to use." He touched his hat brim mocking and walked away. Clara stood at the rail and watched him go, and for the first time since she'd walked into Mercy Ford, she felt something colder than hunger settle into her stomach. She turned back to Midnight. The black horse had come up to the rail during it all, and he stood now with his head over the top rail, ears pinned flat back, the way they went when a man he didn't like came near watching Rufus Pike's back all the way across the yard. Clara laid her hand on his neck. "I know," she murmured. "I feel it too." That afternoon she did a thing she rarely did, which was to seek out the sheriff's counsel. Amos Bell had ridden out to the ranch on some errand of Wyatt's, and Clara caught him at his horse before he left, and she asked him plain what a woman ought to do about a man who'd promised her trouble. Amos Bell took off his hat and rubbed his thin gray hair, and looked as he generally looked, like a man who wished very much that he were somewhere else. "Rufus Pike," he said. "Yeah, I heard he's got it in for you." He sighed. "I'll be straight with you, Mrs. Whitcomb, on account of I think you're owed straight talk. Rufus has got a lot of friends in Mercy Ford. Some of 'em are the wrong kind. And this town—" He hesitated. "This town's real fond of a story, and you've give 'em a good one. Poor widow wild horse rich man. Folks are telling it in every saloon in the county, and they're telling it two ways. One way, you're a wonder. Other way—" He stopped. "Other way I'm a witch," Clara said. Amos Bell looked at her and looked away and put his hat back on. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Clara felt that cold thing settle deeper. "Sheriff, if it comes to it, if folks decide to believe the ugly story, whose side are you on?" Amos Bell got up on his horse before he answered, and when he answered, he wouldn't quite meet her eye, and that was answer enough. "I'm on the side of keeping the peace, ma'am," he said, "whichever side that turns out to be." He rode off. Clara stood in the yard and watched the dust of him, and then the dust of Rufus Pike still hanging in the air from the morning, and she understood with a terrible clarity that she was standing on ground that only looked solid. She had a home for the first time in a year. She had a horse that loved her, and a job she was good at, and a grieving man who mended her roof in the dark, and sat his horse at her corral in the gold evenings, and had told her about Ruth. She had, for the first time since she'd shoveled dirt over Thomas's grave, something worth losing, and that Clara Whitcomb knew was exactly what made her afraid, because a person with nothing left to lose is the safest person alive. It was only now that she'd let herself want something again, that the world had a way to hurt her. She was still standing there when Wyatt came riding out for the evening, and he saw her face across the yard and reined up short and swung down before his horse had properly stopped. "What is it?" he said. "What's happened?" "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her Christian name. She noticed it even through the fear. "Rufus," she said. He came at me this morning. Not with his hands, with his mouth. He thinks—" She stopped and made herself go on, because she'd promised herself a long time ago she'd never again be a woman who kept quiet to keep a peace that wasn't hers. "He thinks I'm working my way into your house and your money. He said he'd turn the town against me. He as good as called me a witch to my face and said the county remembers how to use that word." Wyatt's face had gone hard and still. "He said that?" "He did. To you, on my ground." "On your ground," Clara said. "Mr. Calder Wyatt, I don't care what he calls me. I've been called worse and lived. But that man has got friends, and the sheriff's already told me which way he'll jump, and I've seen how this goes. I've seen it before in another town. A woman alone gets a story told about her, and it doesn't matter what's true. What matters is who's telling it and how many folks want to believe it." She held his eyes. "I need to know something, and I need you to tell me straight, because I've hung everything I've got left on this place. If it comes down to it, if that town comes for me with the ugly story, are you going to stand with me out loud where folks can see? Or are you going to do the thing rich men do and manage it quiet and ask me to keep my head down till it blows over?" She watched him. She watched the question land, and she watched something flinch in him, some old habit of managing things quiet, of keeping the peace, of not making himself a target. And she saw in that flinch, before he'd said a single word, that he did not know the answer. That the man who'd walked the length of his town carrying her bag, the man who'd mended her roof and told her about Ruth, was not yet certain he'd stand up in front of his neighbors and be counted on her side. And Wyatt saw that she'd seen it. "Clara," he started. "Don't," she said. Not angry, just tired and older sounding than she was. "Don't answer now. A thing you have to think that hard about isn't a thing I want to hear rushed. You go on home and you think on it proper." She turned back toward the barn, toward the black horse who trusted her completely because she'd never once let him down. "Just when the day comes, Wyatt, and it's coming, you be sure of your answer before it gets here, because I've buried a husband and a wagon and everything I owned down to my last dollar, and I've found something worth having again on this godforsaken piece of ground, and I will not set it all in the hands of a man who has to think about whether I'm worth standing up for." She walked into the barn and did not look back, and Wyatt Calder stood alone in the gold and dying light with his hat in his hand, and for the second time a woman had shown him the exact shape of his own heart, and this time he did not thank her for it. This time it frightened him, because he knew standing there that she was right about the day that was coming. He could feel it out there the way you feel weather, and he knew that when it came, everything he'd spent 3 years building, every fence, every silence, every careful inch of distance he'd put between himself and the risk of loving anyone ever again, every bit of it would be demanding. He'd do the safe thing, the quiet thing, the thing that kept him from having to stand up in front of the whole county and say, "This woman is mine to protect." And in the end, barn in the shadows where he'd been mending tack, Rufus Pike had heard the whole exchange for the second time in 2 days. He'd heard her ask, "Will you stand with me?" He'd heard the boss say nothing. And Rufus Pike smiled because now he knew the one thing he needed to know to destroy her. He knew that Wyatt Calder would hesitate. The day Clara had felt coming took 11 more mornings to arrive, and it arrived the way most disasters do, dressed up as something small. Rufus Pike had spent those 11 mornings being patient, which was not a thing that came natural to him. He'd stopped baiting Clara at the supper table. He'd stopped hooking his elbows over her corral rail. He'd gone so quiet and so agreeable that the younger hands remarked on it, and Toby said to Clara one evening that maybe old Rufus had finally come around, and Clara said nothing because she knew better. A dog that stops growling hasn't made peace. A dog that stops growling has decided to bite. What Rufus had been doing in those 11 mornings was going to town. He went in the evenings after the work was done, riding in alone and coming back late, and he sat in the saloons and he bought rounds of whiskey he couldn't rightly afford, and he told a story. He was good at telling it. He'd learned over 20 years of making himself necessary to a grieving man exactly how to shape a thing so it landed where he wanted it to land. He didn't call Clara a witch outright. That was too much. Folks would balk at too much. He did something cleverer. He looked troubled. He said he didn't like to speak ill. He said he was only worried for Mr. Calder, a good man, a grieving man taken in by a drifter woman who'd shown up from nowhere and done things with that black devil horse that no Christian woman ought to be able to do. He let the word devil sit next to the word horse. Enough times that folks started hearing a third word he never said. And Mrs. Abigail Crowley, the banker's wife in the fine green dress, who had disliked Clara from the first moment on the first day for the crime of being poor and proud, at the same time took that story, and she polished it, and she carried it into every parlor in Mercy Ford. Clara did not know any of this. She only knew that when she went into the dry goods store in town on a Saturday to buy a length of ribbon, the first small thing she'd bought herself in a year with the first wages she'd earned, the store went quiet. The way the bunkhouse had gone quiet that first night, and a woman she'd never spoken to pulled her child close as Clara passed, and the storekeeper counted her change onto the counter instead of into her hand, so he would not have to touch her. She stood in the street afterward with the ribbon in her hand and understood that the day was closer than she'd thought. It broke 3 mornings later, and it broke over the horse. Clara had gone up to the main house to speak to Wyatt about grain, and she was gone from the far corral no more than half an hour. But half an hour was all Rufus Pike needed. He'd been waiting for it. Waiting for the one gap in her, watching the way a patient man waits, and the moment she was over the rise and out of sight, he went into the end barn, where Midnight stood in the good stall Clara had won for him. And he did a thing so cruel and so deliberate that it could only have been planned. He had a bit with him, not an ordinary bit. It was an old Spanish spade bit, a wicked thing of iron with a high port that pressed up into the roof of a horse's mouth, the kind of bit that a hard old country horseman used to break a beast's spirit through pain, and it was outlawed by every decent hand Clara had ever known. Rufus forced it into Midnight's mouth. He hauled it tight. And then he took a quirt to the black horse in the close quarters of that stall, in the one place on earth where the animal had finally, after a whole hard life, learned to feel safe. He wanted Midnight to do exactly what Midnight did. The horse went mad. Not the cold, refusing madness of the corral on that first day. This was blind, screaming terror, the terror of a creature who had trusted one small pocket of the world to be safe, and had just learned it wasn't, and the betrayal of it undid every bit of the 4 weeks Clara had built. Midnight reared and struck and slammed himself against the stall boards, and Rufus Pike backed out of the stall and stood in the aisle with the quirt in his hand and a red mark on his own face where he'd raked himself with his own fingernails, and he began to shout. He shouted that the devil horse had gone for him. He shouted it loud enough to carry across the yard. 2 hands came running, and they came into the barn to find Rufus Pike bleeding down his cheek, and Midnight screaming and lathered and wild-eyed in the stall, foaming around a bit they couldn't see was there. And it looked exactly like what Rufus said it was. It looked like a mad horse had attacked a man. Clara came over the rise at a dead run. She'd heard the screaming from the main house, and she knew that scream knew it, the way a mother knows her own child's cry across a crowded fair. And she came down the slope with her skirts in her fists and her heart in her mouth. And she hit the barn door and shoved through the gathering men. And she saw the bit. The others saw a wild horse and a bleeding man. Clara Whitcomb saw the iron spade bit hauled cruel into the mouth of the animal she loved, saw the quirt in Rufus Pike's hand, saw the whole shape of it in one sickening instant. And something happened to her face that the men would talk about later, because the quiet horse witch who never raised her voice went white, and then she went into that stall. Mrs. Don't He'll Kill Ya. She didn't hear them. She went to the maddened horse the way she'd gone to him that first day. Except there was no time now for slow, no time for the low, unbroken murmur, and so she did the only thing left, which was to put her own body between Midnight and the thing that frightened him, and let him choose in half a second whether 4 weeks of trust would hold. It held. The great black horse came down from a rear, with his forelegs on either side of her, and did not touch her, stood shaking over her like a storm that has chosen, at the last instant, not to break, and Clara reached up with both hands and got the cruel bit out of his mouth, working the iron free of the bloody flesh with fingers that did not shake, though everything in her was shaking, and she flung it down in the straw and turned around, holding it up so every man in that barn could see the blood on it. "Look at it," she said. Her voice was terrible and quiet. "Look at what's in his mouth. You see that? You see the blood on that iron? That's a spade bit, and it was hauled tight up into the roof of his mouth, and there's not a horse alive that wouldn't go mad from it. He didn't attack anybody. He was tortured." She turned the bit in the light. "Somebody put this in his mouth in his own stall. Somebody who knew exactly what it'd do." The men looked at the bit. They looked at Rufus Pike. And Rufus Pike, who was cleverer than any of them gave him credit for, did not flinch and did not falter. He touched the blood on his own cheek, and he laughed low and ugly. "She'd know all about that bit, wouldn't she?" he said. "Comes running down from the house and knows the exact name of it and how it works. How's a Christian widow woman know a Spanish torture bit on sight, boys? I never seen one before in my life." He looked around at them working them, and Clara watched the doubt move across their faces like a shadow across a field. "I'll tell you how she knows it. She put it there. She's been losing her hold on that horse you all seen him getting wilder this week, and she cooked this up to blame me on account of she knows I've been telling Mr. Calder the truth about her. She put that bit in her own horse's mouth and let him tear my face, and then come running in to play the hero." He wiped the blood. "It's a real pretty piece of work, same as everything she does." "That's a lie," Clara said. "That's a filthy lie, and every man here that's watched me with that horse knows it." "Do we?" Rufus said softly. "Do we know it, Mrs. Whitcomb? We know you can make a horse do things no natural person can. You showed us that the first day in front of the whole town. So how are we to know what all you can make one do?" And there it was. The trap closed. He'd taken the very thing that made her wonderful, the gift the whole county had watched with their own eyes, and turned it into the thing that damned her. Every man in that barn had seen her ride the unrideable horse. Not one of them could say for certain what a woman who could do that couldn't do. Toby, God bless him, tried. "That ain't right, Rufus. She'd never hurt Midnight, she—" "You're a boy, Toby," Rufus said, not even unkind, which was worse. "You're a boy, and she's had you mooning after her for a month. You go on and grow up before you argue with men." Toby went red and shut his mouth, and the shutting of it was the sound of the room turning. Clara stood in the stall with the bloody bit in her hand, and the horse trembling behind her, and she looked from face to face, and she saw it happening. She'd seen it before, in that other town, the year before Thomas. She knew the exact look of a group of ordinary decent men, deciding one by one that the easier thing to believe was the thing that let them go back to their supper. Not one of them was evil. That was the terrible part. They were just tired, and Rufus was one of them, and she was a stranger, and the story he told cost them nothing, and the story she told cost them the trouble of a fight. "Send for Mr. Calder," Clara said. It was the only card she had left. "Send for him now. He'll—" "He'll what?" said Mrs. Abigail Crowley. Nobody had seen her come. She stood in the barn doorway in a traveling dress with two other women of the town behind her, and Sheriff Amos Bell hanging back beyond them, looking like a man who'd been dragged somewhere against his will, which he had. Word had gone to town on fast horses. Word always did. "He'll what, Mrs. Whitcomb?" Mrs. Crowley came a few steps into the barn, picking her way, holding her skirts up off the straw, as though the very ground Clara stood on might soil her. "He'll defend you. The poor grieving man you've been bewitching for a month. Oh, I've no doubt he'll try. That's rather the trouble, isn't it? That's why we've all come." She turned to the men. "This is exactly what I've been afraid of. This poor creature has got her hooks so deep in Wyatt Calder that the man can't see straight, and now she's setting his own hands against each other. A good man's foreman clawed up by her animal. Where does it end? When one of these boys is killed. When she's got the man to the altar, and the whole ranch in her name. Now, Mrs. Crowley." Amos Bell started unhappily. "We don't rightly know. We know what we can see, Sheriff." She rounded on him, and Clara saw the sheriff wilt, saw exactly how it worked. In mercy, Ford saw who really held the reins. Abigail Crowley's husband held the paper on half the town, and the sheriff's wages, and the mortgage on the jailhouse itself, and everyone in that barn knew it. We can see a torn-up man. We can see a mad horse. We can see a strange woman who does unnatural things with animals and has wormed her way into the bed and board of the richest man in the county in the space of a single month. I've held my tongue as long as Christian charity allows. I'll not hold it while our men are being hurt. She drew herself up. That horse is a danger, and that woman is worse, and I say the horse should be put down, and the woman should be put out this very day before there's a funeral in this town. Put down. Clara heard her own voice come out of her low and shaking. You want to kill him. You've never so much as touched him. You don't know the first thing about him. He's the gentlest. He saved my life. Not 2 minutes passed, he stood over me and would not bring his feet down, and you stand there in your fine dress and say, kill him. Tim, listen to her, Mrs. Crowley said almost gently to the room. Listen how she loves that animal more than she fears for these men. Is that natural? Is that a natural way for a woman to be? And the awful thing, the thing that broke Clara's heart, even as it happened, was that she watched the question do its work. Because she did love the horse more than she feared for Rufus Pike, and it was true, and any horseman worth the name would have loved him the same, but she'd let it show, naked in front of people who'd been taught all their lives that a woman's love ought to run only in the proper channels, and Mrs. Crowley had used it against her, clean as a knife. Then Wyatt Calder came into the barn. He'd heard the last of it. Clara saw it in his face. He'd come down from the house and stood in the doorway long enough to hear his foreman clod up his neighbor's wife demanding a killing and a banishment, his sheriff standing weak in the middle of it. He came in, and the whole room turned to him the way the whole room always turned to him. And there was a silence. And into that silence, every soul present laid the same question. Whose side is he on? Clara looked at him across the barn, over the head of the horse she loved, with the bloody bit still in her hand, and she asked him the question with her eyes that she'd asked him with her mouth 11 days before. Will you stand with me? Out loud, where folks can see. And Wyatt Calder hesitated. It was not a long hesitation, a second, maybe two, but Clara had spent her whole life reading the space between when a thing is asked and when it's answered, and she read this one, and it went into her like the spade bit had gone into Midnight's mouth. Everybody calm down, Wyatt said. It was the wrong thing. Clara knew it was the wrong thing the instant it left him, and she saw in the flicker of relief on Rufus Pike's face that Rufus knew it too. Everybody calm down was not this woman is telling the truth. It was not look at the blood on that bit, and tell me who's the liar in this barn. It was the sound of a man reaching out of 3 years of hard habit for the quiet management of a thing, rather than the standing up in it. It was the sound of a man keeping the peace. Let's not do anything rash. Wyatt went on, and every word was a decent, reasonable, cowardly word. Rufus, you're hurt. Go on and get that seen to. Mrs. Whitcomb, Clara. Maybe it's best you keep the horse shut up, away from everybody, just till this settles, till folks cool off. There's no call to be talking about putting anything down, Abigail, and there's no call to be putting anybody out. We'll let it settle. Keep him shut up, Clara repeated. Just for now. Locked away. Where nobody can see he's gentle. Where the story's the only thing left because the horse is out of sight and can't argue for himself. She was very quiet. The whole barn was very quiet. You want me to hide him, so it'll blow over. So you don't have to say out loud in front of these people that I'm telling the truth and your foreman's a liar. Clara, you looked at that bit, she said. You saw the blood on it same as I did. You know there's not a horse alive goes mad in his own safe stall for no reason. You know Rufus Pike hates that animal and hates me, and you know what happened here as well as I do. Her voice did not rise, and somehow that was worse than if she'd screamed. And you're going to stand in the middle of your own barn and tell me to hide the proof and call it letting things settle, so you don't have to be the man who stood up in front of the bank's wife and the sheriff and picked a poor widow over the town. She looked at him, and something broke behind her eyes, quiet and final. You'd rather keep the peace than tell the truth. That's what you are after all. Same as you couldn't kill that horse and couldn't save him either, so you just kept paying men to fail at it. You'd rather manage a thing forever than ever once decide it. It landed. She saw it land. She saw the truth of it hit Wyatt Calder full in the chest and stagger him, because it was the truest and cruelest thing anyone had said to him in 3 years. And it was true, and he knew it was true. But knowing a true thing and being able to act on it in the space of 1 terrible minute in front of the whole town are 2 different things, and Wyatt Calder, grieving cautious 3 years walled up behind his fences, could not in that minute do the second one. "That's enough," he said. His voice had gone hoarse. "Clara, please. Just put the horse up. Let me handle it. I'll set it right, I swear it. Just give me—" "Give you time," Clara said. "That's the thing I give the horses, Wyatt. Time and the freedom to say no. And you know what I learned giving it to them? I learned it only works on a creature that's brave enough to use it. A coward you can give all the time in the world, and he'll just use it to keep on running." She dropped the bloody bit at his feet. "There's your evidence," she said. "I don't want it. I know what I know." And she turned her back on the whole barn full of them, on the whispering women, and the weak sheriff, and the triumphant foreman, and the man who'd mended her roof in the dark, and couldn't stand up for her in the light. And she led Midnight past every one of them out of the barn, the horse gentle as a lamb at her shoulder, proving with every soft step the very thing not one of them would let themselves believe. Mrs. Crowley's voice followed her out. "You see how it minds her? You see, it's not natural." Clara did not stop and did not answer. She put Midnight up in the far corral. Not the stall. Never that stall again. Not after what had been done to him there. And she stayed with him a long while, running her hands over the raw place in his mouth, where the iron had cut him, murmuring the low, unbroken truth to him, the way she had that first day, telling him she was sorry. She was so sorry she'd left him alone for half an hour, and look what the world had done. And the horse leaned his big head against her chest and let her hold him, and the 2 of them stood there in the falling light, the widow and the devil horse, the only 2 souls on that whole ranch who had never once lied to each other. That was where Wyatt found her near dark. He came alone. He stood at the rail a long time before he spoke, and when he spoke, his voice was low and wretched. "They're gone. Abigail and the rest. They've gone back to town. Good for them. Clara, I know how it looked. It didn't look like anything Wyatt. It was exactly what it was." She didn't turn around. She kept her hands on the horse. "You asked me to hide the truth so you wouldn't have to defend it. That's not a look. That's a thing you did. I'm going to make it right." "When?" She turned then, and there was no anger left in her face, which was somehow worse. There was just a great and settled sorrow. The sorrow of a woman who has let herself hope again and been shown exactly why she'd sworn never to. "When will you make it right, Wyatt?" "After it blows over." "There's things that don't blow over. Rufus'll ride to town tonight and tell it his way, and Abigail Crowley'll have it in every parlor by noon tomorrow, and the sheriff already told me weeks ago which side he'd land on, and by Sunday there'll be men in this county who believe I'm a witch and that horse is a devil, and belief like that doesn't blow over. It hardens, it waits, and then one day it comes for you with a rope." She shook her head. "The time to stop it was tonight in that barn with the blood still on the iron and everybody watching. That was the only minute, and you spent it telling everybody to calm down." Wyatt Calder had no answer. He was a man who'd built his whole life around never being in a position where he could be blamed for anything, and he'd just been handed the plain and undeniable blame for the one thing that mattered most, and it had unmade him. He stood at the rail with his hands hanging, and his face gray in the last light. "I lost Ruth because I couldn't do anything," he said at last very low. "The roads were bad and the doctor was late, and I stood in that house, and there was nothing I could do, and I have spent 3 years making sure I was never in a spot like that again, where it all came down to one moment, and I couldn't—" His voice cracked. "And then you came, and it all came down to one moment, and I couldn't. Again, I couldn't. Same as before. God help me, Clara. I froze up in there the same exact way I froze the night she died. And Clara, who had every right in the world to turn her back on him and let him drown in it, could not do it, because she understood grief the way she understood horses. And she heard the true thing under his words, and the true thing broke her heart. "Oh, Wyatt," she said softly, "you didn't freeze the night she died. There was nothing to do, and you did the nothing there was. That wasn't a failing. That was just the awfulness of the world. But tonight, there was something to do. There was a whole barn full of something to do, and you chose the nothing on purpose, because you've told yourself for 3 years that doing nothing is safe. It isn't. It never was." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "Doing nothing is how I lost you before I ever had you." She meant it to be the end of it. She'd said her piece, and she was tired down to the bone, and she'd half decided standing there that she'd take her horse and her wages and walk on come morning before the town's belief hardened into something that needed a rope. But she never got the chance to decide, because that was the night the sky turned against them all. It had been the driest summer in 10 years. The creek that gave Calder Creek its name had gone to a trickle, the grass on the high ridges cured to tinder, and for 3 weeks the whole country had lain under a heat that pressed down like a hand. And that night, far off to the west, the dry lightning came, the wicked kind that brings no rain, just the white forks of it stabbing down out of a black cloudless sky onto ground that hadn't seen water in a month. Clara smelled it before she saw it. She'd gone to her cold bed in the line cabin and lain awake, and somewhere past midnight the wind shifted and brought her the smell, and she was up and out the door in her nightdress, with her heart slamming before her mind had even named it. Smoke. The ridge above the ranch was on fire, and the fire was coming down. It came faster than anything she'd ever seen, a red line running downhill through the cured grass with the wind behind it, and it was running straight for the buildings, for the bunkhouse, for the main house, and for the near barn, where the brood mares were shut up for the night, with their foals, 40 head of them penned and helpless behind a door. Clara ran. She ran barefoot through the yard, screaming the alarm, and men boiled out of the bunkhouse half-dressed, and somebody was ringing the iron triangle, and somebody was shouting for water, and the whole ranch came awake into chaos and terror. Wyatt was among them, pulling on his boots, shouting orders, and then he saw where the fire was headed, and he stopped. He stopped dead. Clara saw it happen. She saw the exact moment the fire running toward the barn full of trapped animals turned into something else. In Wyatt Calder's mind, saw it become a night. 3 years gone, a night of something terrible coming and nothing to be done. And she watched the strongest man on that ranch lock up solid in the middle of the yard, with the firelight red on his gray face, frozen exactly as he'd frozen in the barn that evening. Exactly as he'd frozen the night his wife and son had died undone, useless, a man drowning on dry land while the world burned down around him. "Wyatt!" she screamed. "The mares! The barn! The door! Wyatt!" He didn't move. He couldn't. He stood locked in his own worst night while the real one burned toward him. And Clara Whitcomb understood in that instant that no one was coming to save those horses. The men were fighting the fire at the bunkhouse. The sheriff was in town. Wyatt was frozen. There was no one but her, and one animal on the whole ranch, fast enough, and brave enough, and mad enough to run into a wall of fire if the right person asked him to. She turned and ran for the far corral, and she ran calling his name, not Wyatt's. The horses. Midnight, midnight. And out of the smoke and the red dark, she heard him answer. He came to the corral rail at a gallop out of the dark, and Clara didn't waste a breath on a gate. She went up and over the rail, and got a fist in his mane, and swung up onto his bare back the way she had that first afternoon in front of the whole town, except there was no crowd now, and no silver dollar, just the two of them, and a wall of fire coming down the ridge. "All right," she said into his ear, and her voice shook, but her hands didn't. "All right, darlin'. I know what I'm asking. I know it's the one thing in the whole world you're most afraid of. But there's mares in that barn, and babies at their feet, and there's nobody left but us. You hear me? There's nobody left but you and me. So you're going to have to be braver than any horse has ever been, and I'm going to be right here on your back the whole way, and I will not leave you. I have never once left you, and I won't start tonight." The black horse trembled under her. Every instinct he had, every instinct any horse ever born, has screamed at him to run from the fire, not toward it. And Clara felt him fight it. She felt the war go through his whole body, the ancient terror against the one thing he'd learned in 4 weeks that was stronger than terror, that this woman on his back had never lied to him, and if she said go, then going must be the thing that kept them both alive. He went toward the fire. Clara laid herself flat along his neck and pointed him at the near barn, and Midnight ran into the smoke. Behind them in the yard, Wyatt Calder stood frozen, and then a woman's voice cut through the roar of it. Not his wife's, not a ghost's, but Clara's, screaming his name and the horse's, and he watched a widow in a nightdress ride a horse everyone called a devil, straight into a wall of flame, to do the thing he could not make his own legs move to do. And something in Wyatt Calder that had been 3 years frozen cracked all the way through. He'd told himself the danger of loving was the moment it all came down to one act you might fail. He'd built his whole life to never stand in that moment again. And now, here it was anyway, the exact moment come for him a third time. And there was a woman riding into fire because he wouldn't. He could stand frozen and be safe, and lose her the way he'd lost Ruth, watching helpless, doing the nothing he'd promised himself was safe. Or he could break. He broke. "Water!" Wyatt roared, and his voice tore across the yard like a whip, and men who'd been running in circles snapped toward it. "Buckets, blankets, the well and the creek both. Pete, get the wagon team out of the corral before they panic. Toby, you and the young ones on the bunkhouse roof, wet it down, don't let it jump. Move, damn you, move!" He was already running for the near barn behind Clara, running into his own worst nightmare on his own 2 legs at last. "Clara, Clara, I'm coming!" She heard him. Over the roar and the screaming of the trapped mares, she heard Wyatt Calder shout her name in a voice that had finally decided something, and it put strength in her arms. The barn was full of smoke and full of terror. 40 horses in the dark, and every one of them mad with the smell of fire, throwing themselves against their stalls, the foals screaming for their dams. And Clara knew, she knew from a lifetime of horses, that if she just threw the doors open, they would not run out. A panicked horse in a burning barn does the most terrible thing. It runs back into its stall, back to the only place it knows, and it stands there, and it burns. She had seen it once as a girl, and it had marked her for life. You could open every door and they would die anyway because terror sends them backward toward the familiar, toward the killing dark. They needed a leader. Horses will follow. In a fire, in a stampede, in the worst moment of their lives, a horse that has lost its mind will follow another horse that seems to know where safety is. And there was exactly one horse in that barn, not too terrified to lead, because there was exactly one horse in that barn, carrying on its back the one thing it trusted more than its own fear. "Now," Clara said. "Now, Midnight. Show 'em out." She rode him down the center aisle, and she began throwing stall latches as she passed, and Midnight, trembling, lathered his eyes, rolling white at the smoke, but going, because she asked him to. Midnight walked the aisle of that burning barn at a high, proud, gathered trot, and the mares, seeing him, seeing a horse, moving with purpose through the chaos, seeing a leader, came stumbling out of their stalls and fell in behind him. 1, then 3, then a dozen. The foals pressed to their mother's flanks, and Clara turned Midnight toward the big double doors at the far end, where the smoke was thinnest, and she called out over her shoulder, in the old language of every drover who ever moved. Stock a high wordless cry, and she rode the black stallion out of the burning barn at the head of 40 head of horses like Moses, leading the people out of Egypt, out into the yard, out into the air, the whole thundering herd streaming behind the devil horse into the night. The men in the yard fell back shouting as the horses poured out, and Wyatt Calder, a bucket in each hand, stopped and stared because the animal the whole county wanted put down had just saved every horse he owned. But the count was wrong. Clara knew it the instant she got them into the open and wheeled Midnight to look back. She'd counted as they came. A lifetime of horses had taught her to count without thinking, and there were mares missing, and worse than mares. "The foaling pen!" she screamed. Wyatt was closest. "Wyatt, the two late mares in the foaling pen at the back, they've got new foals they can't run. They won't leave the babies. The fire's between them and the door." He didn't hesitate. That was the thing Clara would hold in her heart the rest of her life, that once Wyatt Calder broke, he broke all the way, and there was not one flicker of the frozen man left in him. He dropped the buckets, and he ran for the barn, and Clara was off Midnight and running beside him before she'd decided to. And the two of them went back into the smoke together. The back of the barn was worse. The fire had the rear wall now, and the heat of it was a solid thing, and the two late mares were exactly where Clara had feared, backed into the corner of the foaling pen, with their day-old foals wedged behind them, refusing to move, doing the mother thing that would kill all four of them, standing their ground against the fire, because they would not leave their babies and could not carry them. "We'll have to carry the foals," Clara shouted. "The mares'll follow the foals, they won't follow us, but they'll follow the babies. You take one, I'll take the other, and we run, and the mares come behind. Clara, that beam." Wyatt grabbed her arm and hauled her back a step, and a burning timber came down where she'd been standing, a shower of sparks and a gout of flame, and for a moment the way to the foaling pen was a curtain of fire. "We can't reach them." One of the hands screamed from the door, Toby, who'd come in after them, brave and stupid and 17. "It's coming down, Mr. Calder, the whole back's coming down." And it was. Clara could hear it in the roar overhead, the sound of a roof deciding to fall. They had a minute, maybe less. 2 mares, 2 foals, a wall of fire between, and a roof coming down. "Midnight," Clara breathed. She didn't even shout it. But somehow, over all of it, the black horse heard her. He'd followed them to the very door of the barn, the one place on earth he most feared, because she was inside it. And Clara turned and saw him there in the doorway, with the fire's light red on his black hide, and she knew what she was going to do, and she hated it, and she did it anyway. Midnight, through. She pointed him at the curtain of flame between them and the foaling pen, and she asked the horse who had been beaten and burned and driven mad by fire, his whole life to jump through fire on her word alone, and the black stallion gathered himself and leaped through the wall of flame and came down on the far side in the foaling pen, scattering sparks, screaming, but there, and Clara understood what he'd given her, which was a way across. "Follow him," she cried. "The mares'll come to another horse, get behind him." The 2 frantic mares, who would not follow a human being through fire, saw a horse standing calm in their pen. Calm, because Clara's voice was in his ear, the whole while, low and unbroken, even now, even here, and it changed everything. Wyatt scooped up one wet new foal in both arms, and Clara took the other, small and slick and impossibly light against her chest, and the mares, seeing their babies carried, seeing Midnight standing steady, came out of their killing corner at last, and the black horse turned and led the whole desperate little band back through the gap where he'd jumped back down the burning aisle, back toward the doors and the air and the living world. The roof came down behind them as they cleared the doors. Clara felt the heat of it slam against her back like the flat of a hand. But they were out, all of them, mares and foals and men, and the black horse out into the yard where the other hands caught the animals. And Toby was crying openly, and the whole ranch was black with smoke and streaked with soot, and alive, every one of them alive. Clara set the foal down at its mother's feet, and her knees went out from under her, and it was Wyatt who caught her, Wyatt's arms that closed around her and held her up, and for a moment, in the middle of the burning ranch, the two of them just held on to each other, filthy and scorched and shaking, and neither one said a word, because there weren't words made for it. They fought the fire till dawn. It was Wyatt who led it now. Wyatt organizing the bucket lines and the wet blankets and the fire break. The men scraped in the dirt with shovels and bare hands. Wyatt who climbed to the bunkhouse roof himself when the sparks jumped. Wyatt everywhere. Tireless decided, a man who had crossed some line in the night and come out the other side a different creature than the one who'd frozen in the yard. And Clara worked beside him, and Midnight worked too. The horse let Clara load water barrels onto his back and pack them up from the creek where the wagon couldn't go, the devil horse hauling water to save the ranch that had wanted him dead. By the time the sun came up gray through the smoke, the fire was beaten. The near barn was gone, a black skeleton smoking against the dawn. But the houses stood. The bunkhouse stood. And every animal on Calder Creek was alive, standing huddled and singed, and breathing in the scorched yard, because a widow and a devil horse had gone into the fire when the rest of the world stood frozen. That should have been the end of it. In a just world, it would have been. But Clara had lived long enough to know the world wasn't just, and she was proven right within the hour, because Rufus Pike had watched the whole night from the edge of it, and Rufus Pike understood that the fire had just undone everything he'd built. He came across the smoking yard, while the exhausted hands were still catching the loose stalk, and he came loud, getting ahead of it the way he always got ahead of a thing. "Well, now here's a picture," Rufus called out. "You all want to know how that fire started? You want to know? Ask her." He flung a hand at Clara. "Dry lightning, some'll say. Awful convenient lightning striking the one ridge above the one barn the very night after she got caught torturing my face off. She's been shamed in front of the whole town, and told to keep her devil horse locked up, and that same night the place burns. And then, oh look, she comes riding out of it. A hero on the very animal we all wanted put down." He turned in a slow circle, working them. Working the tired, sooty men, the way he'd worked them in the barn. "It's a witch's trick, boys. Burn the place, and then save it, so's you look like an angel, 'stead of what you are. I've seen Rufus." Wyatt Calder's voice. It did not rise. But something in it made every man in the yard go still, because it was a voice they had never once heard from Wyatt Calder in all the years they'd known him. It was the voice of a man who had stopped being afraid. Wyatt walked across the yard to his foreman, slow black with soot, and he stopped in front of him close enough that Rufus had to look up. "You want to tell these men how that fire started," Wyatt said. "All right, let's tell them. It started with dry lightning on the West Ridge, same as it started a dozen fires in this county in dry years, and every man here knows it, and you know it too. But let's talk about what happened after the lightning. Let's talk about who ran into that barn." He turned to the hands, and he raised his voice now so it carried across the whole yard over the smoking ruin to every ear. "I'll tell you who didn't. I didn't. I stood in this yard and I froze up solid, and I could not make my legs move, and 40 head of horses would have burned to death, not 30 feet from me while I stood here useless." He said it plain in front of all of them, a proud man laying his worst failure out in the open air. "The only reason there's a single horse alive on this ranch this morning is that woman right there, and that horse right there went into the fire that I could not go into. She led 40 head out of a burning barn. She went back in for 2 mares and their foals when the roof was coming down. And that devil horse you all want put down jumped through a wall of fire on her word to make a road for the rest of 'em." The yard was dead silent. Even the fire seemed to have gone quiet. "So you go ahead, Rufus," Wyatt said, turning back to him, soft again, terrible again. "You go ahead and tell these men she's a witch. But you'll be telling it to a yard full of people who just watched her save everything they've got. And while you're at it," and here his voice dropped, so that later the men would argue about exactly what was said, though they all agreed on the shape of it. "You might explain to them where a torturing Spanish spade bit came from in a barn, where I've never owned one, in the mouth of a horse you've hated since the day she took him off my hands. Because I've had all night in that fire to think on it, Rufus. And I got to wondering, how'd that bit get in his mouth in his own stall in the half hour she was up at my house, talking to me about grain? Who was near that barn? Who came running out of it, bleeding, hollering? The horse went for him in just exactly enough time to have the whole town out here by evening." Rufus Pike's face had gone from red to a bad gray. "Now you wait," he said. "You wait right there. You're going to take a drifter woman's word over a man stood by you 20 years. "I'm going to take my own eyes' word," Wyatt said. "And my own eyes watched you smile in that barn last night, when I told everybody to calm down, when I told her to lock the horse up. You smiled, Rufus. I saw it, and I didn't understand it, and I've understood it since about 3 o'clock this morning while I was carrying water. You smiled because I did exactly what you wanted. You'd set it all up so I'd have to choose between her and the peace, and you knew me well enough to bet I'd choose the peace same as I always had. You know me that well. 20 years you know me that well." His voice thickened just for a second with something that might have been grief for the thing that was ending. "That's the worst of it. You didn't beat me because you didn't know me. You beat me because you did. You knew I was a coward about the one thing that mattered. And you were right. You were right up until about midnight, when a better creature than either one of us rode into a fire and shamed me out of it." "Boss," Rufus started, and the word cracked. "You're done here." Wyatt didn't shout it. He didn't have to. "Right now this morning. Pack your gear and take your horse and be off Calder Creek land by noon. And Rufus." He stepped in close one last time. "If I ever hear you've spoke a word against that woman in this county again, one word I will find you, and I will tell every soul who'll listen exactly what kind of man puts a torture bit in a gentle horse's mouth to frame a widow. I'll spend my last dollar doing it. You understand me?" Rufus Pike looked around the yard for a friend, for a single face that would side with him, and he found none found. Instead, Toby, 17 and soot-streaked and furious, who said in a shaking voice, "I always knowed it was you, Rufus. I just wasn't man enough to say. She told me she wasn't drugging that horse and I believed her over you and I was right." Found the other hands hard-eyed, remembering now every cruelty they'd swallowed from him over the years. Found Sheriff Amos Bell, who had ridden back out at first light and heard the last of it, and who said unhappily but clearly, because even a weak man will sometimes stand up when the ground has shifted enough beneath him, "Best you do, like Mr. Calder says, Rufus. And I'd not linger in Mercy Ford, neither was I you. Folks won't take kind to it once they hear." And that was the thing that broke Rufus Pike, not Wyatt but the sheriff, the sound of the town's own weak weather vane swinging around because Rufus had lived his whole life by knowing which way that vane pointed, and he heard it swing, and he knew he was finished in that county for good. He went white, and then he went for Wyatt. One last animal lunge, a big man's fist swinging up out of 20 years of pride and hate. But he never landed it. Midnight had been standing loose at the edge of the yard by Clara's shoulder the whole while, and the black horse who had learned to read the true thing under a man's movements saw the fist come up, and he came off his hindquarters with a scream, and put himself between Rufus and the man he'd been aimed at, not striking just there, a wall of black horse rearing up huge against the smoking sky, and Rufus Pike stumbled backward, and fell in the ash and the dirt, and lay there beaten by the very devil horse he'd tried to have killed in front of every man whose respect he'd ever craved. Nobody helped him up. He got his gear, and he got his horse, and he rode off Calder Creek land, before the sun was properly clear of the smoke, and not one soul watched him go. Except Clara, who watched him the way she'd watched him ride away that first morning at the corral rail. Except that the cold thing in her stomach was gone, now replaced by something quieter and sadder, because she understood him too well to hate him clean. He'd been a man so afraid of not being needed that he'd tried to burn down the only thing that had ever needed him. She'd met horses like that. There was no gentling a creature that would rather destroy a thing than risk losing it. All you could do was get it away from the ones it might hurt. When he was gone over the rise, Clara felt Wyatt come and stand beside her. They watched the empty place where Rufus had been. "You stood up," Clara said quietly, "in front of all of them." "I did. Out loud, where folks could see. Took me a barn fire to do the thing you asked me to do at the rail 2 weeks back," Wyatt said. His voice was rough with smoke and something else. "Took me watching you ride into fire before I could make myself walk into it. I'm not proud of how long it took, Clara, but I want you to know it's done now, whatever it cost. That county can think what it likes, and Abigail Crowley can talk till she's blue, and I will stand in the middle of Mercy Ford and say the truth of it to every soul who'll listen and every soul who won't. I'm done keeping the peace. I've kept the peace for 3 years, and all it ever got me was a heart like that burned barn." He turned to her. "You were right about all of it. Ruth didn't die because I froze. But I've been dying ever since because I decided I would. And you and that fool horse dragged me out of it same as you dragged those mares." Clara looked up at him black with soot, exhausted past speaking, her nightdress scorched and her hands blistered and her heart cracked wide open. "Don't leave," Wyatt said. "It was the whole of it. He didn't dress it up." A man who'd learned at last to walk into the moment instead of freezing in it, saying the only thing that mattered as plain as it could be said. "I asked you before to stay on and gentle my horses," he said. And that was true, but it wasn't the truth, and I think you knew it. Here's the truth. I don't want you in a line cabin a quarter-mile off where I have to sneak out at dawn to know you're warm. I don't want to be your boss. I've spent 3 years behind fences so high, nothing could get in to hurt me, and nothing ever did, and I have never been so cold in all my life. And then a starving woman gave $1 for a horse everybody wanted dead because she couldn't stand to watch the world throw away a broken thing. And I have been standing here ever since thinking, I am the broken thing. I'm the one everybody gave up on. Even me. I gave up on me." His voice broke clean through. "And you didn't. You looked at me the first day and told me I couldn't kill that horse because there was still something in me that couldn't stand to. You saw it when I couldn't. Stay, Clara. Not as a hand, as—" He couldn't finish it. A big grieving man, and he couldn't get the last word out. Clara finished it for him. She reached up and put her blistered hand against his soot-black face, gentle, the way she touched a frightened horse, and she felt him lean into it, the way Midnight had leaned his great head against her chest, and she said very soft, "As a man who finally understands what I mean to him." "Yes," Wyatt said. "God, yes. That." Behind them the sun broke fully through the smoke at last, and the black stallion who had made a road through fire dropped his head to crop at a patch of green that had somehow survived the burning, and the mares and their foals stood safe in the scorched yard, and Clara Whitcomb, who had walked into Mercy Ford with $1 silver and a husband in the ground, and nothing left in the world she was afraid to lose, stood in the ashes of the only place that had ever felt like home, and found that she had, against all the sense she owned, let herself have something to lose again after all. "I'll stay," she said. She stayed, but staying turned out to be its own kind of fight, because Mercy Ford was not a town that let go of a story just because the truth had changed under it. The word came out of the ranch faster than the smoke had cleared. By the second day, everyone in the county knew that Rufus Pike had been run off Calder Creek in disgrace, and everyone knew why Wyatt Calder had run him off, and there were 2 ways to tell it. Same as there'd always been 2 ways to tell everything about Clara Whitcomb. One way, the widow and the black horse had ridden into a wall of fire and saved 40 head of horses while grown men stood frozen, and Wyatt Calder had thrown out the liar who'd tried to burn her name down. The other way, whispered in the parlors where Abigail Crowley still poured the tea. The witch had finally got her hooks all the way into the grieving fool, turned him against a man who'd served him 20 years, and now she'd have the whole ranch in a year, and mark my words. Clara knew which story Abigail Crowley meant to make stick. And she knew from that other town the year before Thomas that a lie doesn't die when the truth arrives. A lie only dies when enough people decide out loud in front of each other that they won't carry it anymore. And people are slow to do that because carrying a comfortable lie costs nothing, and setting it down in front of your neighbors costs a great deal. "You don't have to go to town," Wyatt told her the first Sunday after the fire. He'd asked her to ride in with him to church in front of everyone, and she'd said yes, and now at the door he'd seen her face and offered her the way out. "We can let it settle. I don't mean the way I meant it before. I don't mean hide. I mean you've earned a rest, Clara. You near burned to death 4 days ago. Nobody'd fault you for staying home." "That's exactly why I've got to go," Clara said. She was pinning up her hair, and her hands only shook a little. "If I hide now, I hand Abigail Crowley the ending she wants. Witch too ashamed to show her face in the Lord's house. No, I'll walk into that church on your arm with my chin up, and I'll sit in a pew, and I'll let every soul in Mercy Ford look at me and decide for themselves whether I look like a woman who'd burned down a barn full of foals." She turned from the glass. "I've run from a story before, Wyatt. Ran clean out of a county. And you know what running taught me? It taught the story it was true. A guilty woman runs, so I'm done running. Win or lose, I'm done." They rode in together, and Clara felt the whole town's eyes on her the moment they came up the street, felt them at the hitching rail, felt them on the church steps, felt the way the murmur rose and fell as she passed on Wyatt Calder's arm. She kept her chin up. She'd promised herself she would. It was Toby who did the first brave thing. The boy was waiting at the church steps with his hat in his hands and his cowlick slicked down with water, and beside him were 3 of the other Calder Creek hands scrubbed and stiff in their Sunday clothes. And when Clara and Wyatt came up the steps, Toby stepped forward in front of the whole gathered congregation and did the thing that 17-year-old boys almost never have the courage to do, which was to speak up in front of his elders. "Morning, Mrs. Whitcomb," he said loud, too loud, his voice cracking on it. "Ma'am, I wanted to say in front of everybody." He swallowed. His ears were scarlet. "I was in that barn when the roof was coming down. I seen what you done. I seen you carry a foal out through fire, and I seen that black horse jump through a flame wall on your say-so, and there ain't nothing witch about it. It's just the bravest thing I ever saw a person do." He turned red as a beet and said it right at the knot of townsfolk by the door, right at the space where Abigail Crowley stood. "And I'll say it to anybody. I'll say it to anybody who wants to call her names. She saved my life and 40 horses besides, and I ain't going to stand here and let folks tell it wrong." The silence after was enormous. And then one of the older hands, a leathery man named Pete, who'd worked Calder Creek 15 years and never said 10 words together in all that time, put his hand on Toby's shoulder and said, "Boy's right." Just that. But from Pete, who never spoke, it landed like a church bell. Clara felt something come up in her throat that she had to fight down hard. It should have turned right there. In a story, it would have. But this was not a story. It was Mercy Ford, and Abigail Crowley had not spent 30 years as the banker's wife without learning how to hold ground that was slipping under her. "How touching," she said, and her voice cut through the morning sweet and cold. "The boy she's been leading around by the nose stands up for her. And the hired men who take Mr. Calder's wages. What a chorus." She came a step forward, and the crowd shifted to give her room the way a crowd always gave Abigail Crowley room, because her husband held the paper on half of them. I don't doubt she rode into that fire. I never said the woman was a coward. I said she was dangerous, and there's a difference. A barn burns the very night after she's shamed and told to lock her animal up, and then she rides out of it a hero, and you want me to call that lightning. I call it a woman who knows exactly how to make a whole town love her for cleaning up a mess she made herself. That's not witchcraft, no. It's worse. It's cunning, and you're all falling for it like children. And Clara watched it work. That was the terrible thing. The thing she'd learned in that other county, a good lie shaped by a clever mouth, could turn even the truth into more evidence for the lie. She'd saved the horses. Proof she'd set the fire. She was brave. Proof she was cunning. There was no fact Abigail Crowley couldn't fold back into her story because the story wasn't built on facts. It was built on the town's oldest, deepest wish, which was to believe that a poor, strange woman who'd risen too fast must have cheated to do it. Clara opened her mouth to answer, though she didn't know what she'd say. But Wyatt spoke first, and he didn't speak to Abigail. He turned and spoke to the whole congregation on the church steps in the plain, hard voice he'd found in the fire. "Abigail Crowley says the fire came awful convenient," Wyatt said. "Let's talk about convenient. You want to know what's convenient? A man wanting to be rid of a woman and a barn fire, giving him one more stick to beat her with." He let that sit. "But there's an inconvenient fact in the way, and it's this. That fire like to killed her. She came out of it with her hands blistered to the bone and her hair singed off and burns down her back that my own hands dressed, and she went back into it a second time when the roof was already coming down for 2 mares that weren't even worth the risk. Now you tell me." He turned slowly, meeting eye after eye. "You tell me what kind of person sets a fire and then near dies putting it out. What kind of cunning is that? There's a simpler word for a person who runs into fire for animals that ain't even hers. It ain't cunning and it ain't witchcraft. It's the plainest word there is. It's good. She's good, and it scares you, Abigail, because you've spent 30 years in this town being important, and you've never once done a brave thing in your life. And here comes a widow with $1 who's braver in her sleep than you've ever been awake." A sound went through the crowd. Not quite a laugh. Something more dangerous to Abigail Crowley than a laugh, the sound of people recognizing a true thing. "How dare!" Abigail started, her face gone blotchy. "I dare because I've done being a coward," Wyatt said. "You want to know the real story of that night? The whole of it? The part nobody's told? Here it is, in front of God and everybody." I froze. Clara Whitcomb rode into that fire because I stood in my own yard and could not make my legs move, on account of my wife, and my son died 3 years ago, and I've been half dead myself ever since, and everybody in this county's been too polite to say it, but you've all known it. I'm the one that failed that night, not her, and I'll not stand on the steps of this church and let this woman's name be dragged through the mud to cover for the fact that the richest man in the county was the weakest man on that ranch when it mattered. Nobody had ever heard Wyatt Calder say so many words at once, and certainly no one had ever heard him confess a weakness in public, and the sheer astonishment of it did more than any argument could have. A proud man laying himself bare in front of the whole town to defend a poor woman. Folks did not know what to do with it, and in not knowing, they began one by one to come loose from Abigail Crowley's story, because her story required Wyatt Calder to be a fool, being led by the nose, and no fool talks like that. Then Sheriff Amos Bell cleared his throat. Clara turned surprised because Amos Bell had told her plainly weeks ago that he stood on the side of keeping the peace, whichever side that turned out to be, and she'd marked him down as a lost cause. But a weak man is not always a lost cause. Sometimes a weak man is only waiting to see which way the weight has shifted before he'll let himself do the right thing, and the weight had shifted now on these steps. And Amos Bell felt it shift, and he took off his hat. "I got to say a thing," he said, "and I'm ashamed it's taken me this long to say it." He turned the hat in his hands. "I rode out to Calder Creek the morning after the fire first light before Rufus Pike lit out. And I looked in what was left of that barn, because it's my job to look, and I found a thing I've kept to myself these 4 days, on account of I'm a coward too, I reckon, in my own small way." He drew a breath. "I found where the lightning struck. Up on the west ridge, a lightning-split tree burned black, the ground scorched all around it in the way lightning scorches and nothing else does. That fire started on the ridge a good half-mile above the barn from the sky, and it ran downhill on the wind the way any dry summer fire runs. There was no lamp knocked over, no coal oil poured, no sign of a human hand anywhere near where it started. I'd have had to arrest somebody if there was, and there wasn't." He put his hat back on. "That fire was an act of God, plain as I've ever seen one, and Mrs. Whitcomb didn't set it. And I've known she didn't set it for 4 days, and I let this woman's name get blackened another 4 days because I didn't want to cross the folks that pay my wages." He looked just for a second at Abigail Crowley. "I'm done with that too, same as Mr. Calder. A man gets tired of being useful to the wrong people." And that was the end of Abigail Crowley's story. Not with a shout, with a sheriff's quiet confession and a burned tree on a ridge. She stood on the church steps with her tea party face and felt the whole town come loose from her at once, and she did the only thing left to a person whose story has died under her. She gathered her skirts and her dignity, and she said something about the heat and the impropriety of quarreling on the Lord's steps. And she went into her pew, and she was never again from that Sunday the woman whose word ran Mercy Ford. Her husband held the paper on half the town still, but a town can fear a person's money and stop believing a single word she says, and that is what Mercy Ford did with Abigail Crowley. From that day, and Clara found somewhat to her own surprise that she could not even hate her for it. A woman that unhappy, that frightened of losing the little kingdom of her own importance, Clara had gentled horses with less fear in them and more heart. She let it go. They went into the church, and Clara sat in a pew beside Wyatt Calder with the whole town's eyes on her. And this time the eyes were different, and she kept her chin up all the same because she'd learned, you keep your chin up in the good moments too, so that folks understand you were never asking for their pity, only their fairness. The weeks after were the strangest of Clara Whitcomb's life, because they were ordinary, and she had not had ordinary in so long she'd half forgotten it existed. The burned land came back first. It always does fire, clears the old dead growth, and the summer rains came at last late but heavy. And where the ridge had burned black, there rose within a month the greenest grass on the whole ranch, thick and new, and impossibly tender, so that the very place the fire had run became the best grazing on Calder Creek. Clara rode up there one evening on midnight and looked at the green coming up out of the black, and thought that there was a lesson in it she'd spent her whole life learning and relearning, that a thing burned to the ground is not a thing ended. Sometimes it's only a thing cleared, so something better can come up where the dead stuff was. They rebuilt the barn. The whole ranch turned out for it, and half the town besides, because a barn raising was a thing folks did no matter what they thought of each other. And by the end of that long day of hammering and hauling, there were men who'd whispered witch 3 weeks before eating at the same long table as Clara Whitcomb, and asking her shy and gruff if she'd take a look at a mare of theirs that wouldn't load in a wagon. She said she would. She said it to every one of them. She had learned a long time ago that you don't turn away a hand that's finally reaching out even if it took the hand too long to come. But the new barn was different from the old because Clara was different on the ranch now. She was no longer the strange woman in the line cabin a quarter-mile off. Wyatt had moved her things up to the main house within a week of the fire proper and public, so nobody could whisper about it, the two of them, to be married as soon as the circuit preacher came through, and until then, Clara in Ruth's old sewing room with the door that locked, and Wyatt sleeping in the bunkhouse himself, rather than give the town 1 inch of anything to talk about. He did it without her asking. She'd noticed that about him since the fire, that he no longer waited to be shown the right thing before he did it. Something in him had been set free to see for himself, and she trained horses openly now. That was the change that meant the most to her. No more far corral where only Toby and the young ones dared to watch. She worked the green stock right in the main yard in the open, and she talked as she worked not to the horses now, or not only to them, but to the young hands who gathered to learn, teaching them the thing that had taken her a lifetime to know. "You're not breaking him," she'd say over and over to boy after boy. "Get that word out of your mouth. You don't break a horse any more than you'd break a child to teach it to walk. You gentle him. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. Breaking is taking. Gentling is offering. You break a horse, you get an animal that obeys because it's scared, and a scared animal will fail you, the one day you need it most because fear's got no bottom to it. But you gentle a horse, you give him time, and the freedom to say no, and you never once lie to him, and you get an animal that'll walk through fire for you." She'd look at midnight when she said it, grazing at the edge of the yard, the scar of the rope burn healed over on his flank. I ought to know. And the young hands listened. They listened to a woman, and they carried what she taught them to other ranches. And there came a day, not that summer, but the summer after, when a man Clara had never met rode 2 days from another county, just to ask the horse-gentling widow of Calder Creek if she'd come look at a stallion no one could handle, and would she teach his boys her way of doing it? And there was money in it, good money. And Clara understood that day that the thing she'd carried her whole life as a shame, the gift that made towns whisper and men uneasy, had become at last in this one place that had decided to let her be who she was, a thing of worth. A trade, a calling, a future. But the deepest change was the one that happened between her and Wyatt, and it happened slow, the way the truest things do over ordinary evenings. He told her all of it in the end, not in one great confession, but in pieces over weeks, the way a man lets water down through a dam, a little at a time so it won't burst. He told her about Ruth, really told her the small things, the way she hummed when she cooked and couldn't carry a tune to save her life, the fight they'd had over the color of the parlor curtains 3 weeks before she died, that he'd have given his whole ranch to have back. He told her about the baby, the son, and the name they'd picked that he'd never spoken aloud to a living soul in 3 years. And when he finally said it one night on the porch, his voice broke on the 2 syllables of it, and Clara took his hand and held it, and did not say a single word, because she'd learned from a lifetime of frightened creatures that there are moments when the kindest thing is to say nothing at all, only to stay, only to not let go. And she told him about Thomas. About the good years and the hard ones, about the fever and the 4 nights and the grave she'd dug with her own hands, about the 10 miles she'd walked before the wagon oxen died, about the exact taste of the moment on the trail when she'd understood she had nothing left in the world, and had felt God forgive her something almost like relief, because a person with nothing left has nothing left to be afraid of. She told him things she'd never told a soul. "I swore I'd never do it again," she said one evening. Midnight was grazing below the porch with the rescued mares and their foals, the summer wind moving through the new grass on the ridge where the fire had run. Never let myself want anything I could lose. I stood at Thomas's grave, and I made myself a promise. Nothing worth losing ever again. It was the only way I could see to stay alive. She looked out at the green and the horses and the long gold light. And then I walked into Mercy Ford, and there was a horse everybody wanted dead, and I couldn't leave him to it. And it turned out that was the crack in the whole wall. You can't save one broken thing without letting yourself love it, and once you've loved one, the wall's down and everything gets in. The horse, and then the work, and then... She looked at him. "Then you." "You're sorry?" Wyatt asked, gently. He knew the answer. He asked so she could say it. "No?" Clara said. "That's the wonder of it. I've got everything to lose now. More than I've ever had. I could lose all of it, you the horse, this place. All of it the same way I lost everything before. I know that. I know it better than most. And I'm not sorry, because the promise I made at Thomas's grave, nothing worth losing. I understand now, it wasn't a promise to stay alive. It was a promise to stay dead, to keep the wall up and stay cold and safe and never feel anything again." She reached over and put her hand against his face, the way she had in the ashes of the fire. "I'd rather have something to lose. I'd rather love a thing and be afraid than be safe and be empty. You taught me that, Wyatt Calder. Or you and that fool horse together did. You showed me a man can freeze up behind his fences for 3 years and still climb out if there's a fire big enough and somebody worth walking into it for. And I figured, if you could climb out a stubborn, cold, shut-up thing like you..." She smiled, and it was the whole smile now, the one that had been too broken to come out that first day in the corral. Then so could I. Wyatt Calder looked at her a long moment in the gold light. "The circuit preacher comes through Thursday week," he said. "I know it. You'll marry me." It wasn't a question, and Clara loved that it wasn't loved that he'd finally learned to walk straight into the thing that mattered instead of circling it careful. "I'll marry you," she said, and she did. On a Thursday, in the last of that long hot summer, in the little church in Mercy Ford, Clara Whitcomb married Wyatt Calder in front of the whole town, the town that had laughed at her and whispered witch about her, and demanded she be put out and her horse put down. The very same town now packed shoulder to shoulder in the pews to watch the widow with $1 wed the richest man in the county. Toby stood up as a witness with his cowlick finally lying flat. Pete came in his one good shirt and cried, though he'd have died before admitting it. Amos Bell gave the bride away because there was no one else to do it, and because he said quietly before they walked in that he owed her at least that much for the 4 days he'd stayed silent. And Clara told him the debt was paid and squeezed his arm, because she'd learned that letting a person make a thing right is its own kind of gift. Even Abigail Crowley came and sat in the back and said nothing, and Clara caught her eye once across the church and gave her a small nod. Not warm, but not cold. And after a moment, Abigail Crowley nodded back, and that was as much peace as 2 such different women were ever going to make. And it was enough. Rufus Pike did not come. Word drifted back over the months that he'd drifted south, gotten work on a ranch 3 counties over, and lost it inside a season for laying a whip to a horse in front of the wrong man. Clara heard it and felt no triumph. Only the old quiet sadness, because she understood better than anyone that Rufus Pike was carrying his fire with him. Wherever he went, the fire of a man so afraid of being nothing that he'd rather burn than be forgotten, and no gentling would ever reach him now. Some broken things do get mended, She'd built her whole life on that faith. But some don't, and the wisdom is in knowing the difference and not breaking your own heart on the ones that won't. And Clara had that wisdom now hard-earned, and she let Rufus Pike go, the way she'd let Abigail Crowley go out of her heart entirely. Because a heart's only got so much room, and she meant to fill hers with what she'd been given, not what she'd been spared. The years came on the way years do. Calder Creek grew into something people talked about in 3 counties, and not for its cattle, for its horses. The Calder gentled horses, folks called them, and they fetched a price above any other stock in the territory, because a Calder horse was a horse you could trust. A horse gentled and not broken. A horse that would stand in a fire and load in a storm, and never once fail you when it counted. Clara trained them, and Clara trained the men who trained them, and her way spread out from that one ranch across the whole country, the way the green had spread up out of the burned ridge, quiet and unstoppable, until there were gentle-handed horsemen in a dozen counties who'd never met her. But did it her way all the same, and never knew the whole thing had started with a starving widow who gave a silver dollar for a horse the world wanted dead. There were children in time. A daughter first, and then a son. And Clara watched Wyatt Calder hold that boy the first night with a look on his face. She had no words for the look of a man given back, a thing he'd been certain was gone forever. And she thought of the name he'd told her on the porch, the name of the son he'd lost, and they did not use it for this boy. That name belonged to the child who'd never drawn breath, and some things you carry rather than repeat. But Clara saw Wyatt whisper something to the baby that first night, and she never asked what it was, and he never told her, and she understood it was him making his peace at last, with the one moment 3 years of fences had been built to escape. And through all of it, all the years of it, there was the black horse. Midnight grew old on Calder Creek, the way a beloved thing grows old, gentled all the way down. At last, the terror worn out of him entirely, so that in his later years he'd let the Calder children clamber all over him and pull his mane and fall asleep against his warm side in the summer grass. This horse that had once crippled 3 grown men and been called a devil by a whole town. Clara would watch her children sleep against the flank of the horse she'd bought for $1, and she'd have to sit down sometimes from the fullness of it, because she'd stood at a grave beside a trail and been certain that her whole life was behind her, and only the walking was left. He died on a summer evening, old and easy in the green grass on the ridge, where the fire had once run, with Clara's hand on his neck, and her voice low and unbroken in his ear, the way it had been that first afternoon in the corral, telling him the truth, the way she always had, telling him he'd been the bravest creature she'd ever known, telling him he'd made a road through fire for her, when no one else on earth would, telling him it was all right now. He could rest. He'd earned it. She'd never once left him, and she wasn't leaving him now. And the great black head came down and rested against her chest one last time, the way it had the very first day. And she held him while he went, and she did not cry until it was over. And then she cried the way she had not let herself cry at Thomas's grave all those years before, cried it all the way out. At last, kneeling in the green grass, with her arms around the neck of a horse. And Wyatt came and knelt beside her and held them both, the woman and the horse, and did not say a word, because he'd learned that from her, that sometimes the whole of love is only this, to stay and to not let go. They buried him up on the ridge in the good grass, and they did not mark it, because Clara said the whole ridge was his marker, the whole green sweep of land that had come back up out of the fire he'd carried her through. Clara Whitcomb lived to be an old woman on Calder Creek, and she never once regretted the $1. She'd say it to her grandchildren in the end, when they'd climb up beside her on the porch in the long gold evenings, and ask her to tell it again. The story of the day she rode the devil horse out of the corral. The story the whole county still told, grown half to legend now. She'd tell them all of it, the laughing crowd, and the whip, and the $1 silver held up in the sun, and they'd listen the way children listen to a thing they've heard 100 times, and love more each time. And at the end, one of them would always ask her the same question. Why? Why'd you do it, Grandma? Why'd you give your last $1, your only $1, everything you had in the whole world, for a horse everybody said would kill you? And Clara Whitcomb would look out at the ridge where the grass grew green over an unmarked grave, and out at the ranch that had grown up around a thing she'd started with a silver $1, and back at the house where a man who'd once been frozen behind his fences had spent 40 years proving he'd climbed out for good, and she'd take the child's small hand in her old one, and she'd say the truest thing she knew. The thing her whole long life had taught her, and taught her, and taught her again. Because the whole world will tell you a broken thing is worth nothing, child. The whole world told me. They laughed in my face. And they were wrong. They were wrong about that horse, and they were wrong about that man, and they were wrong about me, a poor half-starved widow with $1 and a grave behind her, and not one soul who thought she was worth saving. She'd squeeze the small hand. A broken thing isn't worthless. It's just waiting. It's waiting for one person brave enough to stop trying to break it harder and to sit down quiet beside it instead and to say, I see you. I know. Me too. That's all it ever takes. One person willing to listen. I was that person for a horse once when I had nothing else left to give, and it gave me back the whole world. And that is the truth of it, and it never changed. And Clara Whitcomb carried it to the end of her long life and handed it on, that no soul and no creature is ever past saving. And the bravest thing a person can do in all this hard world is to look at the thing everyone else has given up on and step forward and offer it everything you have, because $1 and one open hand and one heart willing to listen is enough to buy back a life the whole world had thrown away.